Where? Did you
the person
upload?
Put it on. They put it on. That person over
Person.
there put it on.
Okay, maybe this one is yours. Yes,
Yeah,
maybe
me.
this.
That's
Okay,
it.
okay, because you are the session 6, so.
That's it.
Okay, it is yours.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, just I close it. I have to save. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Dave. Your equipment. Maybe we can start. Good morning, everybody. We have one minute. We have one minute. Okay.
Something like that.
Okay.
So no, if you have fast track, things like that, 1 hour voice is fine. But you know.
Yeah. Okay, we have time, but more or less, German more or less.
Yeah. So within 30 seconds.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We can start, and I would like to ask Quentin Bourgeois to chair session 6, please.
Good morning. Welcome to the final session of this fantastic conference already. We only have keynotes this morning, so I would like to get into it. I'm looking forward to it. With the first keynote speaker, Martin Veulholt, Riva 2023 recap, big picture and important details on the third millennium BC in Europe. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, I was asked by Volker and the other organizers to give a kind of recapitulation about what happened at the first conference of this two-conference package back in October when we were at this wonderful place near this lake and the mountains. Fantastic setting. Now this is not working really. Okay, maybe we have to turn it on. No, it's on. All right. So so this was a conference that had a kind of focus on the second half of the third millennium, focused especially on the bell beaker phenomenon, but not only. It was organized in 6 sessions, very similar to the setup that it is here. And I will focus on 5 themes from these sessions, themes like the origins, the beginning of the bell beaker phenomenon, the variability, regional variability, kind of content, what's behind the bell beaker phenomenon, if there is anything behind it actually, how to characterize bell beaker related societies, and of course the impact of ADNA, the genetic transformation that we see and what that makes with our narratives. So let's start with the first theme. I will try to also give a little, mention the speakers, and I think I have more or less gotten everybody. And if I have forgotten something, that is, of course, something that I would hope people not take personal. So the question about beginnings was tackled in the beginning of the conference, actually, by our Portuguese colleagues, Maria de Jesus Sanchez and João Luís Cardoso, who talked about and discussed this evidence for bell beaker pottery that dates, according to some C14 dates, to the time already around 2700 BCE. And this is actually a controversial topic. And it was controversially discussed also in this conference because, as you can see, it's not that many dates. The context can, of course, always be questioned, and it was questioned on the conference. I think there needs to be done, we need more dates actually to confirm this kind of idea that this pottery style develops earlier in Portugal than it does anywhere else. In any case, I think we are mostly talking here about, let's say an earlier beginning of a pottery style, and then of course we still have to ask the question, what does that actually mean for the understanding, the overall understanding of the bell beaker phenomenon? Especially also that Volker Heid showed, we can also go to the other side of the distribution in the Rhine Basin. We also have earlier dates here than the average dates that we find in other places. Quentin showed yesterday what you actually can do with systematic modeling. But in any case, what Volker showed is that in this Rhine basin, you have very early maritime beakers, and this is probably the place where this kind of merging of bell beaker material culture with genetic step ancestry seems to somehow start. That's at least what Volker was showing, and this would actually then make a very complicated origin story for this whole phenomenon, because we have this kind of different directions which are merging in somehow. There is reference that could be made to Edward Sangmeister's reflux theory, as it was also referenced by Ralf Grossmann at the Riva conference. So much for the beginning. So you see I'm coming to some certain topics in a relatively fast manner, but we will be a little more concentrated in the later part of the talk. The second theme was that about regional developments. And what I will show you now is, not so surprisingly, rather heterogeneous stories for every single region that was dealt with at the conference. So Olivier Lemercier, for example, discussed and showed the southern French material, the Rhone Valley especially, and he could show how bell beaker materials are slowly integrated into late Neolithic assemblages, and only in the later period of bell beakers then the bell beaker material takes over as such, and then the late Neolithic traditions more or less disappears, and this continues into the Bronze Age. This is a very, very different picture than Ana Catarina Basilio and Pilar Prieto Martinez showed for different places in the Iberian Peninsula, where you actually have a rather selective presence of bell beaker pottery in some sites, while you have a total absence of bell beaker pottery in other sites. So it seems to be a situation where you have a conscious adoption or a conscious rejection of these kind of objects. In the Adria regions, a number of colleagues talked about the Franco Nicolis, Staso Vornbacher, Maya Gori, Giulia Reccia, Elisabetta Bordnia, all talked about different, let's say, interactions of bell beaker material with contemporary styles that are not bell beaker. So how is the relation of those bell beaker materials to styles and communities such as Cetina, Ljubljana culture, and even also the Aegean Bronze Age? Ralf Grossmann discussed the situation in central Germany, where we have this kind of interesting interplay and also complex interplay between corded ware and bell beaker pottery styles and also burial rituals. And this is also the region, as we just talked about a little earlier, where you also seem to have this kind of split off of some genetic lineages, as it seems, from corded ware realm, then constituting bell beakers later. So it's a very interesting kind of dialectic relationship, as it was called in the 1950s by Ulrich Fischer. Dialectic relationship between bell beakers and corded ware, where they're actually doing the same thing but slightly different. And it seems to be intentionally different. Going to Ireland, Neil Carlin again showed a very different situations where bell beakers are mostly found in settlements, where the typical burial assemblage is missing, but then, to make up for that more or less, you have a strong connections to copper metallurgy, where daggers are deposited in large numbers and even some gold artifacts appear. Mike Parker Pearson talked about the British material. Here, again, it's a very interesting situation. We know from the archaeology and also from genetics it's a very sudden change, a very sudden start of bell beakers shortly after 2500 BC. And what you then see is that the bell beaker people related to bell beaker phenomena are not anymore associated with these large communal building projects like Stonehenge, even if they are present in the region. On the other hand, you do have, for example, such communal projects like Woodhenge, like Silbury Hill, that are still being constructed and worked at the time when bell beaker is already around. So there is a kind of duality of communities, as it seems, also when it comes to these kind of monuments and monumental building projects. Mike Parker Pearson also showed the results of his strontium isotope analysis, and he pointed to a relatively high well, a proportion of mobile people, so around an average of 40% of non-locals in every assemblage in Britain that he looked at. Although this is a small-scale mobility, mostly confined to the British region, and it is also really not much more than before, so it's actually a continuation. This kind of behavior is a continuation of the Neolithic behavior. It's not really something out of the ordinary, even if it looks very high with 40%. And then there are these exceptional individual long-distance movers, which are probably the ones who you can see as a kind of pioneers for getting this kind of bell beaker package into Britain, like the Amesbury Archer. But this continues over many centuries. It's not only at the beginning. So we come now to two talks, Wolfgang Haag and Alisa Mitnick, who also integrate DNA and ADNA and archaeology into their presentation of regional groups. And this was Wolfgang Haag, who referred to mostly the Papach et al. Paper, where he pointed to this very weird, in a way, or strange situation that you have this very strong both cultural and genetic segregation between corded ware and bell beaker, or bell beaker and everybody else, basically, in Bohemia, which, as you can see here from the, I think this at least works, you can see it from the Y chromosome haplotypes, where the bell beakers form a very distinct group here, which is not mixing anymore after 2500 with other groups, especially not corded ware, even if they are closely related to each other. But this is a big contrast towards the first half of the third millennium in Bohemia, where there is a large genetic diversity in early corded ware. And this seems then to change in the late third millennium. And then Alisa Mitnick discussed the Italian material and showed how, if you look at the different bell beaker contexts all over Italy, you find a huge variability in the step ancestry proportion in all of these regions. Most significantly, I think, in southern Italy and in Sicily, the first step ancestry is really only coming in at the end of the third millennium, and it becomes prevalent only in the second millennium, so very late. Okay, the third theme that I want to talk about is the theme, what is actually behind the bell beaker phenomenon, if there is something. And I think this was part of the discussion. Volker Heydt proposed that there is something. He proposed that one could see the bell beaker phenomenon as an expression of a religion, referring to, for example, the relatively frequent appearance of kind of sun symbols or other celestial signs, which, if you link this to what we know about Mesopotamian and Egyptian religions, makes sense, and also the kind of standardized burial rites, I think is something that you could think of as being an expression of a more formalized, institutionalized form of belief system, something we could talk about as a religion. And I think that makes a lot of sense, at least maybe not for the whole phenomenon, but for some certain parts of the phenomenon, and I think it's something that's very much worth discussing. Mark van der Linden had a very different kind of approach to explain how we come up, how this kind of super-regional system of similar objects and similar practices emerged. It comes more from this kind of interaction theory approach, where he would argue that this similarity appears as a function of frequent interaction, rather than having some kind of uniform ideology or belief system behind it. He referred to the concept of homophily from Axelrod, which means that, or which uses the kind of observation that when people interact with each other, when people who have certain cultural similarities interact with each other, they tend to somehow create and develop more and more similarity through aligning their habits and their kind of cultural preferences. He combined this with considerations about collective action or collective action theory, arguing that also politics, social norms, and shared beliefs could then be aligned in such a kind of way. Very different approach than Volker's, but also something that is, I think, worth thinking about. And then as a third approach to explain what's behind the bell beaker phenomenon came from Carsten Wenting, who is at least also here today, like Volker, by the way, I think you know that. So Carsten has, and this is work coming out of his PhD, published in 2020, where he argued, and I think it's a very fascinating kind of out-of-the-box way of thinking, not always emphasizing this kind of warrior ideology behind bell beakers, but rather looking at the kind of assemblage that you see in these burials. And there are these beakers, there is the archer's equipment, there is small kind of tools, a dagger, and he argued quite convincingly, in my view, that this is exactly what the earliest traveler that we know of, the Iceman Ötzi, what he basically carried with him when he was crossing the Alps. And he argues that you could think of this kind of bell beaker phenomenon as a kind of material expression of an, super-regional system of travelers and hospitality, where they would use specific symbols to signal, the possibility to come when you're traveling, to be welcome, to get a drink, and all these things with people who are somehow part of this kind of super-regional social group, like Esperanto maybe, or something like this in the more modern period. So I think also a very interesting question to think about. So all in all, I think it was an interesting debate about very different ways of conceiving or conceptualizing what actually could be behind bell beakers. The first option that we saw is, okay, there is a kind of set of shared ideas or related practices, maybe even institutions like a religion or something like this, that could be responsible for this kind of unification of material culture all over the western part of Europe. Or it could also be the tools themselves. That would be Carsten Wenting, the kind of properties of those tools, this kind of beaker, alcohol drinking, or this kind of hospitality, that somehow do then motivate certain parts of behaviors, leading to this kind of homogenization of certain elements that you can see across Europe. And the third is, as van der Linden was talking about, goes also, I think, in the direction of what Quentin Bourgeois showed yesterday, that we have rather a kind of emergence of patterns through frequent interaction. Okay, how to characterize bell beaker-related societies? That was the next big theme. We had several talks by Marie Bess, Eve de Rennes, and Quentin Favrel, who were showing results from pottery technology studies, which is, of course, a much underused source of information when it comes to traditions, social traditions, and their interactions in local, regional, and also trans-regional settings. And what they could show, and it seemed to align quite well, in both Switzerland and in France, is that you tend to have quite a diversity of different pottery or potters' technology traditions in the early part of bell beakers, and then a kind of homogenization over time, which would speak for some kind of situation where all the different elements of bell beakers would not form a kind of initial package, but rather be things coming together at one point and then homogenizing, which is a little opposite to the kind of standard model where we think we have an initial idea which then spreads out. Yeah, Guus Kronen was also here today. Yeah, there you are. Talked about, which is a very relevant and important question, what language these people might have been speaking. He argued that, the bell beaker phenomenon has not really been, appreciated enough as a possible, carrier of, for example, and you can correct me if I say it wrong because I'm not so knowledgeable in this part, that you could very well, or he made a point that basically this kind of Italo-Celtic sub-branch could be something that is spread by bell beakers in the same way as maybe Germano-Baltic Slavic is something that could be associated with bell beaker according to the distribution patterns. Then gender roles is something that Eni Soriano brought in, and I thought it was, in a way, quite interesting that this, gender discussion hasn't really reached the third millennium Bell-Beaker Chordate discussion as much as you would expect it, given the kind of prevalence of this topic in the social sciences in general. So Eni Soriano was trying to make this point that we actually should be a little more investigative when it comes to gender roles in the third millennium. The kind of idea of a binary model being, what really characterizes the third millennium is very dominant. Robin Harris, for example, argued that this is the time basically when this very strong binary gender model is established in Eurasia, and this is the beginning of our way of looking at gender. However, Eni argued that you should question, this kind of binary, and you should look more into the kind of variations that there are, because everybody also knows that there are deviations, but they are not really explored as something that might be a kind of a relevant and interesting phenomenon. And what he was showing is that, as we know, the binary gender scheme does exist empirically. So that's very clear, but there is, of course, also quite frequent crossings of the binary gender model when it comes to the biological sex and the cultural gender in the burials. And it is very clear that it's mostly women who are able to cross this, while the male social roles seem to be much more fixed. And he was then making the point that one should also look more closely at this and argue that it probably means that that women in that time were actually much more flexible when it came to their gender expression than men actually were. Then a very important point to me too is the male warrior paradigm. This is something which was discussed quite intensely, and what also shook me very much, I have to say. The male warrior paradigm in the third millennium is, I think, the most commonly accepted of all these kind of different elements of social organization in the third millennium. And it has to do with the prevalence of shaft hole axis in male chordate ware burials. So now we are going a little more to the whole third millennium. And then, of course, dagger, bow and arrow in the Bell-Beaker set, and is always seen as clearly we are talking here about warriors. That's very clear association of these weapons with male burials. But then again, Carsten Wenting showed that the useware analysis that he had performed on these axes, I have one here that he gave me, he borrowed to me, useware analysis from chordate ware battle axis or shaft hole axis, did all kinds of things, as you can see, smashing in pigs' heads and trying to chop down trees. They didn't leave this kind of useware that you have on a lot of those axes. What did leave this kind of useware is that when you use them for uprooting trees. So basically, it's a kind of combination of cutting into wood, earth, and gravel. So I think this, for me, I always thought, okay, these are clearly weapons, but the kind of strange Dutch farmers, they somehow misuse them for something else. That was how I often then, for many years after I read his PhD, took it. But after his talk, and also in the kind of discussions in Riva, it was really something, he made a lot of good arguments, especially having this thing in your hand, you realize this is also the length of this shaft is something that is coming from an archaeological find. So this is how they look like. They are ergonomically not really practical for fighting. It's much too heavy here on the top, and a very, very thin and long shaft that doesn't really make any sense. And we have also seen that, at least these Dutch ones, they have not been used for that. Also, chopping down trees doesn't really work very well. It's not practical. So this is really something that we should think about. I mean, especially if you think about those incidences we have in the third millennium of violence. Mostly other tools are used to kill people than these kind of battle axes. If they would be the kind of weapon that everybody is shown with in the burial, why do they use other things than other implements usually to kill? I mean, Anna Thornberg showed yesterday I was happy for that at least, okay, there is evidence that they have been used, but in most cases, other implements are used, like flat axes or these kind of pickaxes, arrowheads, of course. So this is really interesting, and we really have to ask our questions, why do we think that these things are weapons? We think that these are weapons, of course, because we think they're status symbols, and we see this association with male burials, which makes sense. But then, still, why do they have to be weapons? I mean, yeah, they are associated with male burials. They're also shown on stelae in combination with other tools like daggers and halberds, which we also think are weapons, and I think they are weapons. But still, it doesn't mean that, you know, being shown together with weapons, you also have to be a weapon. And anyway, I mean, couldn't also the kind of male cultivator who is clearing the fields be a high status function in an agricultural society who just invented the plow, and where this idea to get rid of these trunks is very, very important? I mean, this is the kind of material basis of wealth in the Neolithic, and having a kind of specialized agricultural tool as a status symbol, I think it's at least something we have to think about, especially since the tradition of association of these shaft-hole axes with male burials is something that clearly comes out of an agricultural context. I mean, here in Alchonic, this is of course already Copper Age, but already in the late Neolithic you have this association of shaft-hole axes with male burials in a period where we are clearly dealing with a very agricultural society, and I think it is, and also you don't have this kind of high degrees of violence being attested. So I think it's at least something worth thinking about, why we actually think these are weapons. Maybe they are not weapons. Maybe the whole male warrior paradigm falls apart. I was very amazed also to see the talk from Denis Topal, who was also still here, I hope, on, what was it, Wednesday, where he actually showed that weapons in Yamnaya burials are extremely seldom. Even if you take away the shaft-hole axes, they might be even less than 5%. Signs of violence are also very seldom. So this is not a warrior, a warlike society. So this kind of stereotypical male, Yamnaya male warrior from the internet is a pop culture fantasy. But of course he is there because he has a lot of plot armor, because he features in this kind of very important idea about, you know, steppe warriors or young youth warrior bands and all these things, which of course, you know, have all their plausibility. But we could also frame it differently, and I think especially Yamnaya is, I think, something that needs to be thought about when it comes to, you know, warrior or not warrior. And then also we can go, of course, back to the bell beakers, and, you know, if the warrior is not so clearly prominent, we could also see this bell beaker equipment. If it's not a traveler's equipment, it could also be a hunter's equipment, or hunter's equipment could be very handy when you are traveling. Instead of weapons. I mean, especially also since some of the daggers are extremely small, and also the kind of degrees of violence in bell beaker contexts, as we have seen, it's rather low. Parker Pearson showed for Britain that we have a lower rate of signs of violence. I mean, you know, you talked about it, how it's of course not the best measure, of course, but as long as we have this, it doesn't look as if there is a kind of uptick in violence in bell beaker. In the British Isles, and also not in the continental, or like say France. Germany, Peter Röcher also doesn't show that, and as we saw now from Denis Topal, Yamnaya also doesn't. Okay, this is one point. The second point, which I think is interesting, is the point of patrilocality when it comes to social organization. Also something we need to think about more thoroughly. There is also a kind of consensus now, especially through this paper, but also others. Rögren, I mean, it's Christiansen, you are the last author here, aren't you? Yeah. And Volker. So patrilocality is something that is more or less a consensus now. It has been attested through a lot of different methods. For example, a comparison of the variability of Y chromosome haplotypes and mtDNA haplotypes, so representing the kind of male versus female kind of variability, genetic variability, and of course strontium isotopes. And I think there are two problems with this which we need to discuss more thoroughly, I think. One, I think that the question of what is being asked usually in this paper and in others is whether patrilocality exists. And I think this is a too narrow question. as Bradley Ensor has shown in his book here, The Not Very Patrilocal European Neolithic, which gives away his main idea already. It's not so much that, it's not factually wrong to say that the data would indicate patrilocality, but the problem is that it could also indicate a lot of other things. It could indicate, as he, for example, argues, neolocality or bilocality or a lot of other patterns of residence, rules of residence after marriage. And I also think that there is a kind of low threshold for confirmation when it comes to patrilocality. So you have a few more mobile females and males, and you say, okay, that looks like patrilocality. And I think it's something we need to look a little more closely into. And then, of course, you should not identify patrilocality with patriarchy or the kind of male-dominated system as something that Kate Freeman and colleagues have argued. I also think there is a kind of lack of interest in female identities when it comes to the third millennium. Cordetware, bell beakers, they're usually attested a rather passive role, or they are not really discussed the kind of variability of female roles. I think Louise Ohlerud is one of the exceptions here, which I think should give a kind of role model for how you should also look more closely into the social role of women in the past. Okay, last point, the genetic transformation. 9 years ago, this really changed almost everything we thought about the third millennium. Here is a citation from Haag et al. Our genetic data provide direct evidence of migration and suggest that it was relatively sudden. And the point that was discussed in Riva was the question of the suddenness and what that actually means. In the popular literature, it was argued, for example, that we have this is the British situation where the Beaker impact comes in with a step ancestry, and you have this total flip of genetic profiles in just a few centuries, as it is said here. And then the question is, for archaeologists, what does it mean? Does it really mean that the people were wiped out or something like this? Here is the evidence. It's a very clear evidence, I think. But the question is, how can you actually explain this archaeologically? I think such a kind of wiping out of population is something that, of course, we know happens, but I would like to see more dead bodies in order to make this point. I don't think that there are these kind of mass graves and this kind of mass killings that we can test for, but I think it's not enough for the whole of Europe, and definitely also we don't have it, as I've already shown, in the British Isles. And also Mike Parker Pearson made the point that we have to always keep in mind that the burial evidence that we are dealing with, from which the genetic evidence usually comes, of course, is not a kind of representative sample of population, but rather a very unrepresentative sample of the population. It is a few % of a living population, which is clearly very socially selective. And thus, we have to always assume that such very abrupt changes just would somehow, and they do correlate, of course, with changes in the burial ritual. So there are new forms of burial reserved for certain kinds of people. And in that way, of course, we cannot assume that this switch here really represents the real switch in population that is that sudden as it seems here. And then Ian Armitt made a kind of calculation, which just somehow trying to give a little context here. This genetic transformation, which is so clearly shown up in these burials, works quite well. So it's a 93% exchange in the genetic code, but it actually works quite well without any kind of mass extermination or anything. If you assume that you have two populations, it's just a theoretical assumption, but to illustrate this, you have, let's say, in 300 years, which is a reasonable, relatively sudden. This is relatively sudden in an archaeological point of view. In 12 generations, you have the difference between 1.8 to 2.2 average surviving children per female. If you have this difference, you end up from two equal populations to 93 to 7%. And this is because we actually underestimate the kind of effect of different growth rates, for example. And if that is amplified over the generations, then we we do underestimate the kind of the exponential nature of this effect that you can have. And you can go, with a 2% annual growth rate, which is a lot, but it is something that happens in human populations. You go from 100 people to 51,000 people in about 300 years. Or with a 3.5%, which is something that's known in Africa, in recent societies, you would go from 100 people to 6.5 million in 300 years. And this means you can have total replacements of populations in 300 years, which is not without any kind of wiping out of the population. It might not even be something that people would recognize as happening actually in a kind of social sense. All right, I'm coming to the end. I'm summing up here. The main takeaways for me are as the beginning that I showed, bell beakers are integrated into social contexts in very different ways, and thus denote a whole lot of different things in different regions. So I would personally, I do accept this idea that in some instances, a religion, an organized religion, could be responsible and could be also argued for being important here. But otherwise, I would say that what we are dealing with is quite different societies who are interacting with each other and thus developing, or we have this emergence of cultural similarities coming out. That's a personal opinion, of course. My takeaway is that shaft-toll axes are likely agricultural tools, and the idea of battle axes is now with a burden of proof. So we should do more user analysis in order to figure out what these tools actually are made of. Third, a little provocative here, the following elements of the main third millennium narrative are not supported by the data: patriarchy, warriorhood, elevated levels of violence, at least not across the board. I saw your talk yesterday. Strict binary gender roles, and this idea of mass migration as a kind of socially experienced reality in a very short time, like 1 or 2 generations. And then, not to be taken totally serious, I have a kind of alternative scenario about the third millennium as such. So Yamnaya herders were, and that's shocking, not only males, but as Dennis Topal showed, it's more or less males and females, and maybe also other identities that we don't really know about because we don't really ask those questions. Instead of being warriors, they were a bunch of peace-loving hippies, mostly interested in the pleasant things of life, like their identities being expressed not through weapons, but through, let's say, nice clothes, ornaments, and beautiful hairs and hair ornaments, as we find in those burials. They tried horseback riding, but falling off the back of the horses, as Trautmann and colleagues have shown, they thus decided to stick to cattle-drawn wagons and went with them westwards. They went westwards when to their south kings, cities, and armies appeared, and they did what every sane person would do. They just dispersed into all directions possible, east and west, as fast as they could. And when they then came into the dense forests of the west, their adapted pastoralist lifestyle didn't really work anymore, and so they adopted the hard-working cultivator as their new social ideal, symbolized here through this agricultural tool, which is then cordetware, and further to the west, a subunit refrained to hunting and traveling as a more pleasant and less ardent lifestyle, being bell beakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think it's the first time that I've heard Yamnaya being referred to as peace-loving hippies. I love it. Thank you. Are there any questions for Martin?
Thank you, Martin. We have had an ongoing discussion which has been incredibly stimulating, sometimes very fun, at conferences and in other places, sometimes in print. And we're still good friends because that's what science is about. Science is about to question established truth. And there is no such thing as established truth. There are established facts and evidence, but the way we interpret them, of course, is what we always have to debate. And you are very good at raising that debate, and it forces me and others to sharpen our arguments or give in. And I like you press it to the utmost. I mean, this reminds me of my youth in the 1970s, peace and love. you know. And of course, we're always inspired by the present. So in a way, it's nice to see it's coming back. I feel younger again when I hear you. And so thank you so much. And I'll go home and think hard.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think it's a little more complicated than this, but I think the point that I wanted to make with this is just how important framing is. You know, the way you frame your data, whether you frame it through this lens of, warrior bands, or you frame it through a different lens, I think it comes to very different scenarios in the end. So, and I think it's worth looking at the material from very different ways. And I've also given in a lot of things that you have said, so I think we're fine.
Other questions? Because otherwise I have one. Somewhere at the start of your lecture, you reflect back on Bellbeaker, and we heard about Cordware and Yamnaya, and you mentioned somewhere that you think there's an intentionality between the difference between Bellbeaker and Cordware, and a dialectic emerging somewhere in central Germany. How do you see that dialectic happening? What do you think is sort of the basis behind that?
Yeah, that's this very peculiar situation that you have basically in the overlapping area where you have both Cordware and Bellbeaker. Not everywhere. In Netherlands, for example, it does not happen. You don't have this dialectic. I think also the burial rituals are relatively similar. But in Germany, also Bohemia, you have a very clear separation. So within the same framework of this kind of, or I call it single burials, mostly single burials, and a clear orientation of graves and gender being marked, and also this specialized agricultural tools, drinking beverage containers. There are specific sets of symbols which all appear, but after some centuries of this kind of being associated with Cordware material culture in these regions, it seems that some people start to interpret it a little different, and they turn around the gender binary when it comes to the deposition, and also they orient to the north-south instead of the east-west. So they still have the same kind of system in mind how burials should look like, so something that could refer to religion, for example. But they do interpret it slightly different, almost like a kind of reformation or something going on, where they split off. And geneticists have shown basically that a lot of them are actually a subline of, a subset of Cordware, or could be a subset of Cordware individuals who start doing this. And then there is a total, they don't really overlap so much anymore. Ralf Grossman showed that, of course, in material culture there are some overlaps. So it's not so 100% clear. And there are also, I think, one or two individuals who switch back, so to say, being genetically in this nucleate, but they're still, buried as Cordware people. But it is something very weird. I think Wolfgang Haag talked about this as being like a sect or something, where you close yourself off socially and genetically, so being in that respect then the same, because you somehow don't interact anymore with people from whom you have split off in an ideological way, probably. So yes, I think this could be interpreted in this way, that there is really an intentional ideological split off, religious split off.
Protestant Reformation. Yeah.
Hello, David Anthony. The comment I would like to make is that there's a resource here for information that it seems, I wasn't there at the conference, but it seems like it is being underutilized. And that is the comparative pathology of Indo-European and the reconstructed vocabulary of Indo-European. In religion, there's the comparative mythology and the reconstructed vocabulary tells us an awful lot about whoever they were, wherever they were, and whenever they were. It tells us an awful lot about what they were thinking in terms of religion. We don't have to go to Egyptian sources, which are quite distant. We can go to Indo-European sources to reconstruct what they were thinking about religion. For hospitality, it's extremely important. The guest-host relationship, patron-client relationships are documented there in the Indo-European, or Proto-Indo-European vocabulary, which can shed an awful lot of light on these claims for peace. I think it's absolutely true that we are undervaluing the effect of institutions that promote hospitality and patron-client relationships and peace. But I think those institutions were important in the past because the past was so violent. And so you can have both of those at the same time. Also, gender binaries. You know, there's an awful lot of information in Indo-European vocabulary about gender binaries, and finally the warrior sodalities. You know, the comparative mythology of Indo-European languages is rich with information on warrior sodalities. Whether they were dominant or not, that's a completely open question, but they were certainly present. So I think in all of these things, we're ignoring a resource that's out there, that's a very rich resource. Yeah. And I think the reason is that it's a whole nother, it's like the new information about genetics. It's an entirely different field that you have to become familiar with in order to use those resources. And we don't feel comfortable as archaeologists extending our archaeology out in that direction. I believe, though, that if we did, we would come to a much more complete and full understanding of the past.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is probably the reason why I left out this source was a little that this is my own personal perspective. In my view, this kind of narrative of warriors, war bands, patriarchy, and so on, is something that is coming into archaeology exactly through that route that you talk about. And I wanted to push back a little against that. Although I do agree with what you just said, that it's probably not so much the Indo-European sources themselves that are making this push. But it is basically some preconceptions about how things should be, which we should always question, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin.
One more, I think.
Oh, sorry. Yes, yeah. I was told to stick to the time, sorry.
Thanks, I'll try to make it brief. Nils Johansen. So thanks a lot, Martin. You showed Mark van der Linden's model of dispersal, and I think it's quite relevant for also the things that have been discussed at this meeting, because there have also been various perspectives on modes of dispersal of cultural traits in the Yamnaya, Global Amphora, and Cote d'Ivoire. And we saw this more or less sort of self-organizing system model where you have homogeneity appearing simply as a function of interaction. I think this echoes back in the history of archaeology to the new archaeology, processual archaeology of the 60s and 70s, where there were discussions of material culture styles, and there was some sort of equation made to say stylistic similarity is a function of degree of interaction. But then came, in the early 1980s, came people like Ian Hodder, and they showed very clearly using ethnographic examples that, well, it all depends. You can have a very close interaction and neighborhood relations that lead to strict boundaries because there's a perceived need to differentiate between the groups. Or you can have the opposite. You can indeed have, styles melting together. So my point is, we need the ideology. I think this was also your conclusion in the end of your talk here, or the discussion. We probably need the ideology regardless. Because you won't, because you can have high interaction, but can result in anything but homogeneity.
I would totally agree. Maybe I made a little too much of this opposition between these models that were proposed, and actually I think they work quite well together.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. We have to unfortunately move on with the program. It's a dual lecture in two parts. The first part is by David Reich on the genetic origin of the Indo-Europeans, and that will then be followed by David Anthony and Dorcas Brown on the Yamnaya origins.
Yours. First one here.
Hi. So I'm going to be presenting on behalf, actually 3 papers, and in 10 slides. And I thought it was important for a geneticist from our team. This is very much a collaboration with David Anthony, Joseph Lazaridi, Nick Patterson, Alexei Nikitin, and Harold Ringbauer, and others. But I thought it was important for a population genetic analyst on our team to present that part of the work, and David will present the other part of the work. So I'm very glad to be here, and I've met a lot of people I haven't met before, but have worked with, and other people who I've really enjoyed meeting. So it's been a pleasure being here. So I'm going to begin by talking about the data that is presented in the 2 papers that we released last week. It's whole genome genetic data from 372 people, dating from about 6,200 to 2000 BC. The Yamnaya sample size that we have available for analysis quadruples to about a little bit less than 300 people from more than 100 sites. The Eneolithic sample size from the relevant region approximately doubles to about 160. And there's a massive increase in Eneolithic data from 2 key regions, from the Volga and the Dnipro rivers, which is a particularly rich part of this particular set of studies. And there's key new sampling from the Caucasus, Lower Volga, Eneolithic at the sites of Berezhnovka and Remontnoye. That contributes in an important way to the analyses that I'm going to describe. And we co-analyze with almost 1,000 previously published and very important data from the literature. And so this is a joint analysis of this new data, which was selected to address these problems with the previously published literature, which speaks to some of the same problems. So here's the relevant sites that are being analyzed. And I'm not going to talk about every site, but I'm going to highlight first Berezhnovka, which is over here. It's in the lower Volga region. And genetically, it's very, very similar to these sites of Progress 2 and Vonyuchka, which were published a few years ago. And despite being over a very broad region and in basically the 5th millennium BC. With a little bit more, a lot more Caucasus relatedness, there is the MyCop individuals who have been previously published, and the Caucasus, one of the South Caucasus Neolithic samples from Akhnashin that was published. And then there's this Remontnoye sample, which is, has an intermediate genetically between these two, and I'll talk about this a little bit more shortly. The Berezhnovka samples are buried in kurgans with raised knee styles, typical of the north. The Remontnoye samples are also buried in kurgans, but they're on the contracted on the side MyCop style, and we see these influences from south and north across this region. So I'm going to first talk about the first result, which is that this high-resolution sampling in the Neolithic discovers 3 previously unknown pre-Bronze Age clines in the region, which collapse with the formation, with the spread of the Yamnaya and disappear due to the disruption that happens then. But they're extremely informative to see them because it's out of these clines that the Yamnaya and other important phenomena arise. So I'm going to walk you through these 3 clines. The first is the Volga cline. So this is a principal component analysis. I don't have time to explain how it's built. But you see there's gradients of ancient individuals that are sort of shown with these lines, but you can see there's dots forming along this gradient. And one of them we call the Volga cline because it's oriented north-south along the Volga and with almost complete ordering with respect to the people on the different parts of the river. On one extreme are eastern hunter-gatherers, who are the hunter-gathering population distributed across a broad region. Then sort of intermediate on the cline are Khmelynsk culture people and also people from Ekaterinovka. And at the end of the cline are these Berezhnovka people in the lower Volga who are similar to the Progress 2 Vonyuchka people in the Caucasus. The second cline is the Dnipro cline. It's on the Dnipro River, and it's a different mixture of local Ukraine Dnipro hunter-gatherers and to some extent possibly Don hunter-gatherers, such as the Golubaya Krenitsa individual, although we don't have very good sampling along the Don currently. And another axis. So here's the Ukraine hunter-gatherers. And then here are many samples from the Eneolithic Sredny culture. And then there are some Yamnaya toward the end of this gradient from the Don. And then most Yamnaya, what we call core Yamnaya, I'll come back to this, name and nomenclature are in this huge cluster of red dots at the end over here, and they are very, very much on this Dnipro-Klein, and it's very possible to show and very clear that they form out of it, that the Yamnaya are late Sredny Sti population. They're directly descended without mixture from Sredny Sti. They formed around 4000 BC, and that the Yamna formed from that. The last Klein that appears is this one, which is probably maybe the most interesting of the three, and we call it the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein, CLV, and it consists of, again, Berezhnovka at one extreme, and then samples at sites like Progress 2 and Vonyuchka, which is almost at Berezhnovka, and some of them are as extreme as Berezhnovka. Then there's Rim-Onoya, somewhere in the middle, and then there is Maikop, almost at the end, and then there's the South Caucasus Neolithic from Akhnashin at the far extreme. So this Klein is very interesting, and I will talk about it some more after the slide switches, which it's sort of slow about doing. So the second result is that this CLV Klein, which persists mostly from 4500 to 3500 BC, throws migrants in all directions in a very dramatic way that creates various phenomena nearby. So here's another depiction. So this is the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein 1. This is the Volga Klein 2. This is the Dnipro Klein 3. So the Berezhnovka end of the Klein mixes with the local eastern hunter-gatherers and creates people at different proportions of ancestry through moving up and down the Volga. That's one process, and that produces people of the Khvalins culture. The Dnipro Klein is a mixture of a different point along the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein, and which is a group that is mixed on one end by this Maikop-like ancestry or Akhnashin-like ancestry and Berezhnovka on the other, but it's not the same source from the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein. So you should think of it as a metapopulation with people with different points along that gradient. They're exchanging genes, but what forms the Dnipro Klein is a different position along that gradient than what forms the Volga Klein. And the Volga Klein is irrelevant to Yamnaya formation. The Khvalins culture is irrelevant to Yamnaya formation. The Yamnaya are unadmixed descendants of Sredny Sti people, and they can be accurately modeled with about 80% ancestry from this Caucasus Lower Volga Klein. It's their main ancestry, 4/5 of their ancestry, and about 20% Ukraine Neolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry. Then there are long-distance westward CLV migrants that bypass intermediate European farmers like Tripilians, and they leave unadmixed CLV people from the Berezhnovka end in Ksongrad in Hungary, and also at Gurguleshti in Moldova. They go all the way across this region, and it's tracking possibly the Balkan-Khvalinsk copper transit. Westward CLV migrants also mixed along the way. They didn't also go through unadmixed. With European farmers, they mixed a little, maybe a few percent, to form Tripilians. We detect this ancestry. And then, again, with the already mixed Tripilians to form Usatovo, which is half CLV on top of that. And then with other farmers to form Cernavodă 1 and other examples. And there's smaller examples than these three as well. So there's lots of waves of ancestry coming out of this core zone. South of the Caucasus, we find, and this is a major new result, that CLV migrants mixed with Mesopotamian farmers, to contribute to likely Anatolian speakers in the Central Bronze Age sites of Kalahoyuk and Ovarin, which are spread from about 2800 to 1500 BC. And an Ovarin individual actually has a large IBD distant relative segment shared with one of the individuals from Vonyuchka, so it's direct evidence of sharing across this region. So this ancestry was definitely north of the Caucasus. It's not South Caucasus like Akhnashin, and that's because this ancestry brings with it some north of the Caucasus admixture. So this is a hard population replacement of the Central European Bronze Age population. Previous work, the original paper that published this, which was Damgaard et al. Science 2018, and our reanalysis in 2022, we didn't detect it, neither paper detected it, and they genetically look similar to their neighbors in a superficial way, but in fact their composition is in detail different, and it looks like a completely different population that's completely discontinuous with the people who were there before, so that instead of being composed of a Copper Age Bronze Age Anatolian substrate, it's actually a mixture of CLV Klein and Mesopotamians, both of which are exogenous ancestry components that are associated with these plausible Anatolian-speaking regions and differ from all their contemporaries nearby, which fit that model of coming from the earlier populations. So these results maybe point to a solution to the problem of geographic homeland of Indo-European languages. So the split of Indo-Anatolian is conventionally dated by many studies, although some people dispute this, to maybe 4,300 to 3,500 BC. Here's 3 references. And the first split is Proto-Indo-Anatolian to the Anatolian languages, like Hittite and Luwian, and classical Proto-Indo-European, leading to, most people agree, but not everybody, all other spoken and some unspoken Indo-European languages. The predominant view is that this expansion of the Yamnaya is what spread classic Proto-Indo-European, and in our model, Yamnaya are 80% Caucasus Lower Volga, so if you think that the Caucasus Lower Volga people spoke an Indo-European language, it makes a fair amount of sense that the Yamnaya might have gotten their language from these people. And then the samples we sample from Kalahuyuk, for example, if you model them with MyCop, for example, are 30% CLV. And so this is a single gradient of ancestry that's contributing both to the south and north. And it's the first genetic evidence, if I'm aware, for a link in the right time between the steppe and the Caucasus. Genetics alone can't resolve whether the languages come from the south, like the Mycop Eknatian-like populations, or the northern Berezhnovka end of the gradient of the CLV Klein. And the solution has to come with synthesis of linguistics and archaeology. There's influences culturally, as I understand it, both from the north, such as these raised knees burials that we see at sites like Berezhnovka. And there's influences from the south, like sheep and milk. Sabine Reinhold talked about this, Kurgans, and contraction on the side. Gus Krunin, in a paper in 2022, argued that there are serial terms shared across Indo-Anatolian languages, suggesting that Yamnaya formed in a region that used agriculture for its subsistence, and that retained words from the ancestral Proto-Indo-Anatolian languages. And this would add weight to a theory of a southern origin, because agriculture was used in the south, and that the ancestors of the Yamnaya persisting in the Dnipro Valley are westward. That's because the agriculture continued to be used in the Dnipro Valley or westward, and that's consistent with our identification of the Yamna as late Srenistri from the Dnipro Klein. Okay, so result 4 is that genetics actually provides strong evidence for an eastern route for the expansion of Indo-European languages in Anatolia, which is challenging what's probably the prevailing view of this model. So Alwyn Clockhurst, in this paper in a recent volume, The Indo-European Puzzle Revisited, made a really cogent case for a western route, with the strongest arguments being an entirely western distribution of these circled major branches of Anatolian languages, which split very deeply between 2000 and 3000 BC, according to the estimations. And an argument is that you have if they come in from the west, it's parsimonious to have a simple route dropping off these languages, but if you come from the east, you have to have a convoluted route in order to produce this type of pattern. That's part of the argumentation. But the likely Anatolian speakers from Kalahuyuk and Ovarin, who represent a local population replacement, a hard replacement, and have 10 to 30% CLV ancestry, depending on how you model them, they have none of the European farmer or the Anatolian Chalcolithic Bronze Age ancestry one would have expected them to pick up along this route. And even if you, for the sake of argument, think that they're like Gurguleshti and Xongrad and they just didn't mix with anybody on the way, actually, in these samples from central Anatolia, the major ancestry, 70 to 90% of it, is not local either, and it's Eastern. It's from Mesopotamians. So that, again, points even more strongly to an Eastern route. So how could you get the situation where you have a Western distribution of languages? So a hypothesis that we suggest is that maybe what you're seeing is the impact of the Kura-Araxes expansion around 3000 BC. So the absence of Anatolian languages in the East could maybe be explained by the sort of archaeologically momentous Kura-Araxes expansion, and which we showed in 2022 was again a hard replacement. It completely displaced previously established Chalcolithic northern ancestry that was present at sites like Areni Cave in the region. And maybe it drove a wedge of Hattic or Hurrian speakers, for example, through the Indo-Anatolian speakers, both north and south of the Caucasus, and just erased the previously spoken Anatolian languages in the eastern part of the region. So that could potentially explain the Western distribution. So this doesn't disprove a Western route, but it biases us to it. So for example, I think sort of probabilistically often, and the odds on a Western route before these data, based on the arguments Klockhorst put forward, might be 5 to 1. If you think the genetic data, as I do, are very strong evidence, maybe 25 to 1. In the other direction, maybe you end up with a 1 to 5 odds that it's an Eastern route rather than a Western route, but that it's still plausible for it to be a Western route. Result 5 is that the Yamnaya expansion broke correlations between geography and genetics. So the Srednji ancestors of the Koryamnaya, you can determine when that mixture occurred by seeing the sizes of chunks of CLV and Ukraine Neolithic ancestry in the sampled Koryamnaya, and it dates it very precisely because of the huge sample size to about 4100 to 3900 BC. When this mixture of these components formed, and that's right in the Srednji period when we see the gradient. And so that makes sense that they're direct descendants. And then we also see in our genetic data that there's an intense founding event, a relatively small number of individuals reproducing, just a few thousand in the community, that rocket up. This is a log plot during the Yamnaya period to many tens and even hundreds of thousands of people very rapidly. So you see what's a classic founding event of what might be a clan, perhaps. One could imagine innovating culture and economy that eventually expands with the Yamnaya associated with cultural innovations. So the earliest Koryamnaya we have genetic data for that we can establish is Koryamnaya that experienced this bottleneck that's genetically entirely of the right ancestry components is at Mikhailivka in the lower Dnipro. It dates to about 3600 to 3300 BC, radiocarbon. And it's from one of the rare areas with continuous settlement in the Neolithic to early Bronze Age transition. In this region, we suggest very speculatively, not at all, it's not a tight argument, is a candidate for being a place where Yamnaya might have formed. The Yamnaya expanded so quickly that people buried in cemeteries a few hundred kilometers apart are only slightly more closely related to each other than people buried thousands of kilometers apart. And it really just loses correlation to distance in this context. It's very different from patterns seen in other groups. So an invitation is that, like 286 Yamnaya is a lot, but it's insufficient to study relatedness networks. And we have funds actually to sequence thousands of more Yamnaya. And with this type of data, one could actually build up detailed patterns of movement at finer scales and relatedness networks. So if you have ideas or know of samples that could be added to this collection, they probably won't show very many new things about ancestry, but they would identify interesting outliers and might make it possible to learn about these patterns. Result 6, and the final result I wanted to talk about, was that the steppe ancestry in the corded ware was overwhelmingly from the Koryamnaya. This is very clear. It shares the 3600 to 3400 BC founder event that we detect in the Koryamnaya. So I'll shortly walk you through this. This is a result that was in a technical paper, Harold Ringbauer et al., that we published a little bit earlier, but it was a population history result that might have gotten buried in that paper. So this is a plot of the degree of sharing between lots of groups whose names are invisible on the screen because they're too small, but it's from the paper. I understand that the people watching this on YouTube can see this more clearly than the people in the audience. So if it's a bright color, there's a high degree of allele sharing, and this corner down here is Yamnaya, and they're closely related to each other due to the Yamnaya founder event. This is the corded ware. They're closely related to each other, mostly due to the Yamnaya founder event that they inherited. And these are globular amphora. They're closely related to each other due to perhaps their own founder event. So in yellow, this is sharing between corded ware and globular amphora. It's unambiguous evidence, as Martin Sikora also discussed, of the farmer-related source for corded ware being largely globular amphora. And this is relationship between corded ware and Yamnaya, which shows an intense degree of sharing, which traces to the Koryamnaya founder event. So the sharing with choriamnia is strongest in the early corded wear, the very group that Papac et al. In this important paper argued might have a non-Yamnaya source. So it is not true that a different population at the beginning of corded wear was the source of their steppe ancestry, and it gradually got replaced with steppe ancestry. It's even stronger at the beginning. So a puzzle is how could descent of steppe ancestry in the corded wear from choriamnia be reconciled with the corded wear people not carrying the R1BY chromosome that's overwhelmingly seen in choriamnia? So Papac themselves give a possible answer to this, answer whereby waves of Yamnaya women plus waves of globular amphora women keep being imported into corded wear communities and swamped out the original corded wear genome, except on the male lineage where the Y chromosome differed. So an example of this is on this site, which I'm going to mispronounce, Vlinievs, and the green marks in this principal component analysis are samples from this early corded wear site. And you can see that they range on this axis, which is their proportion of steppe ancestry at the top and farmer ancestry at the bottom. And at the extreme, there's people who are genetically entirely Yamnaya-like, and in fact are choriamnaya, basically, genetically. And at the other extreme are people who are entirely globular amphora farmer-like. And in the middle is where corded wear ends up within a handful of generations, and most people are. What you notice is that the boxes are males and the circles are females, and the females are at both extremes. So all the extremes in females are Yamnaya, all the extreme Yamnaya-related are females, and all the extreme farmers are females, consistent with this model. So a female-mediated spread of steppe ancestry into the corded wear, it differs from the narrative that westward steppe expansions were always mediated by males, which is sort of a naive thing that one might think. And it could explain the lack of sex bias in the westward steppe expansion, or lack of strong evidence of sex bias that, for example, we found when we looked at it in this paper in 2017. But actually, if you think about it, this still could have been a situation of male exploitation, in this case of Yamnaya or globular amphora females by corded wear males in this case, so that you have an initial movement that's Yamnaya mediated, and then a corded wear importation of Yamnaya women, and then a further expansion of corded wear. So that's it. Result one is this high-resolution sampling discovers 3 previously unknown pre-Bronze Age clines. Result two is that this cline, the CLV cline, threw migrants in all directions and impacted neighboring region. Result three is that these results suggest a Caucasus Lower Volga origin to the Indo-Europe Anatolian homeland. Result four is that genetics suggests an eastern route into Anatolia. Result 5 is that the Yamnaya expansion broke correlations between geography and genetics, and result 6 is that the steppe ancestry in corded wear people was overwhelmingly from Choriamnaya, and they shared the Choriamnaya characteristic founder event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amazing results, I can say. I saw the paper coming out on Tuesday evening, and I was already reading it on the plane flying here. But this is really, I think, a breakthrough, I would say. Do you want to have questions now, and David after, or what's?
We haven't really decided.
You haven't coordinated? Okay. Then maybe questions now, or? Are there any questions? Louise.
Hi, Louise Ollerud from Leiden University. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. My mind is absolutely blown. I was wondering about the lack of the sex bias that you just spoke about, because I thought that Goldberg et al. 2017 wrote about a male sex bias. However, that it couldn't be replicated was in a response paper. But I thought that those results were still kind of circulating, or at least the idea of a male sex bias. However, you spoke about that there was a lack of sex bias, so could you perhaps elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the Goldberg et al. Paper in PNAS argued for a 14-to-1 sex bias. We wrote a response in the same journal that said there's no detectable sex bias, and they wrote a response saying they still think there's a sex bias, but less than they thought before. My view is that there's no statistically significant evidence of a sex bias by rigorous methods. That continues to be my view. I'm extremely interested in testing for it, and we just we and other people I've interacted with have found no convincing evidence of sex bias. It's in part due to the lower resolution. It could be. It's probably not no bias, but in fact, I don't even have an opinion about the direction that the bias would be in.
Any other questions? Eric?
Hi, Eric Ron, Leiden University as well. Thank you for your talk. The one thing that we seem to keep on doing at this conference and in cordetware in general is that we look at that very first high cordetware sort of ancestry population to think about the dynamics of that migration and what went on with the individuals in the indigenous populations. Do you think that that's the correct approach, or would you rather say we need to look further into the Bronze Age to see what was going on there?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a mystery how this Koryamnaya ancestry and possibly other components of ancestry get into the cordedware. We haven't really seen a real interaction zone between globular amphora and Nyamnaya, except maybe at Villeneuve's. I don't know. Ancient DNA, the magic of it is you can go back in time to the period when events actually occur and sample from that context. So I think that in principle, the answer would be getting data from the right time and place at the beginning of the process. It's highly likely we haven't sampled exactly the right regions, although the Papach et al. Paper definitely begins to tell part of the story, I think.
Thanks, David. Great stuff. We started already a nice discussion yesterday morning on this founder effect, but I think it might be worth to share our discussion a little bit with the audience here. So there could be two reasons for such a founder effect. One is demographic, and we had earlier lectures about climatic fluctuation. You could have played a role in it, but there might also be a social reason for this founder effect in terms of certain families, certain clan progresses faster and with more people than others. What's your opinion about this?
I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, but I favor the opinion that it's a clan and it's a social phenomenon, that this is a group that develops some innovations, and it's in a group of Srednji derivative populations that, you know, are competing or, you know, living side by side according to different customs and some set of innovations. You know, maybe it's a particular ideology that promotes expansion, or maybe it's the cart or horse usage, or, you know, a certain way of exploiting economies, and that contributes to their expansion. It doesn't necessarily imply a contraction. This data could be entirely explained by a single small successful clan just expanding super dramatically and then not mixing very much with its neighbors. The other thing that you see in the data is that there's not much mixing with their neighbors. So once they start expanding, they will encounter other people genetically like them, but they're actually excluding them from their marriage practices. You can see that in the data too.
Just to expand on this, and you said, David, that this was a genetic explanation about sex bias. But if you look at the archaeology, there is clearly sex bias in the early phase. We demonstrated that also in that paper we did for the Indo-European volume. That in the early phase, nearly all of the burials are males, have high step ancestry, and there are virtually no female burials. So there is a social mechanism going on here, or of where male promote their identity. So in that sense, there is a male dominance.
Yeah, I'm not questioning at all that this is that the sexes behave differently, and that there was a sex bias in these processes. And in fact, I'm aware of a lot of the evidence you're talking about. I'm just saying that the naive thing that we started out thinking when we started working on this was that because of our presuppositions and our biases we brought to the problem, we were going to think that the steppe ancestry would have been moved in by males. That actually is not obviously true because of the dynamic I'm talking about. It's not to say that this was not a world full of male sex bias. It's just that there's a mechanism by which a series of male sex biases chaining across different cultures at their interaction zones can produce, from the narrow, unimportant perspective of steppe ancestry, something that looks like not sex bias, even though it is.
Okay, Sven Hansen is asking, thank you for your talk, and it's a very strong idea to that there is a clan-based origin of Yamnaya, which is spread over whole Europe. How many children one has to produce to can be as a founder of such a big clan-based DNA? I mean, there are examples from Iran in the 19th century. The ruler family of the Qajar produced more than 100,000 children, and would be that the dimension in the?
I don't think these people are reproducing with people from other groups. They're reproducing with themselves. So it's not like a single powerful individual has children with lots of new, people brought into the community. It's people are mixing within the community and not bringing in other people into this community that has these cultural practices. So I don't know. It's an exponential growth problem, right? I mean. Martin was talking about this. If you dial in a certain growth rate over 10 generations, you can get pretty dramatic expansion.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. I just want to, no question, I just want to underline how important this paper is to the debate on the Indo-European homeland. Of course, we have had this big debate between the steppe homeland and the Anatolian homeland. So far, there wasn't any evidence for a steppe intrusion in Anatolia, so it was actually difficult to fully reject the Anatolia hypothesis. But with this new evidence, there is such a vector, so it really is a decisive moment, I would say. So you say point 3 is that, it favors that's 4. It favors a eastern route through the Caucasus over a western route into Anatolia, but actually just the fact that there is a route into Anatolia, that's one of the biggest results, I would say. So congratulations.
Yeah. I think we have to move on to the next lecture, otherwise we run out of time. The next paper is by David Anthony and Dorcas Brown on the Yamnaya origins and the expansion of late Proto-European languages.
It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. I just want to start with that. This has been a fantastic conference. I want to thank Volker Heide and Gabi for organizing this. It's been wonderful. David Reich was just saying I'm presenting data on archaeology, and I'm not an archaeologist. Today I want to talk about linguistics, and I'm not a linguist. But as I said earlier, I think this is extremely important. I wasn't really sure what David was going to say before me, and what I'm going to talk about is therefore going to be pretty different. I want to talk about the Indo-European part of the title of our joint paper, the genetic origins of the Indo-Europeans. And I do feel like most of the people in this audience are uncomfortable assuming an Indo-European identity, overlaying Indo-European linguistics on archaeology. So really what I want to do today is to make you more comfortable doing that and defend the Indo-European side of the title. So the location and the date of the late Proto-Indo-European homeland, and I say late, you can see in this diagram there are these two very important distinctions in the development of Indo-European languages. One threw off the Anatolian branch, and that's the only surviving information on the earlier phase of the development of Proto-Indo-European. And then late Proto-Indo-European threw off all of the other known Indo-European languages according to most reconstructions. We have a lot of data to reconstruct late Proto-Indo-European. Almost everything on this chart can be used as a resource to reconstruct late Proto-Indo-European, so it's much more richly known than the earlier phase is. So I'm going to be talking mainly about late Proto-Indo-European just because we know so much more about it.
And the location and date of the late Proto-Indo-European homeland is constrained by reconstructed late Proto-Indo-European words. That's where I start. It's a linguistic problem at its heart. And so you must start with linguistic evidence. Words and their dated archaeological correlates, and that's how you bring in archaeology. And late Proto-Indo-European gives at least 4 constraints on the location and the date of the late Proto-Indo-European homeland. I've recently published a paper in which the title is 10 Constraints on the Indo-European Homeland, but I have time here for just the first 4. So constraint number 1 is wheels. Late Proto-Indo-European contained at least 5 reconstructed terms for wheeled vehicles. We know from a large amount of data that wheels were invented after about 3500 BC. There's virtually no evidence for wheels before that. And between 3500 and 3000 BC, we have evidence for wheels both in at least 300 actual wheel and cart, wagon and cart burials in the steppes, and written signs for wheeled vehicles in Mesopotamia, 2-dimensional images at sites like Zushin, which were talked about earlier in this conference, 3-dimensional images famously in Hungary and burials in Hungary. There is a whole chorus of data on the existence of wheeled vehicles after 3500 BC, and the chorus is absolutely silent before 3500 BC. We can be pretty certain about the date of the invention of wheels. So wheels were invented after 3500 BC, therefore late Proto-Indo-European had to be spoken after wheels were invented, because here are at least 2 terms for wheel, 1 for the shaft hole or thill, 1 for axle, and 1 verb for to go or convey in a vehicle. Just like if you read a text that contains the word hard drive in the text, that text was written after 1978 because that word could not have existed before 1978. A vocabulary with wheeled vehicles richly represented in it had to be spoken after 3500 BC. Right there, we have late Proto-Indo-European was spoken after 3500 BC. Constraint number 2 is the terminology for cultivated plants, which Huss Krunen and his crew have been looking at for the last few years and have published on. And this is taken from his work. The agricultural terminology is weak in early Proto-Indo-European as we can reconstruct it, and it is stronger in late Proto-Indo-European, but it's pretty weak in both of them. Early Proto-Indo-European, or the Anatolian branch, has 2 really verifiable roots. The meanings of them vary, and so some people say we can say that one of these roots probably means barley, but being really strict about it, we can say that both of them mean edible seed, and that could actually refer to a wild plant. And their team said, here's the quote, "The scarcity of shared cereal cultivation and processing vocabulary at this stage, early Proto-Indo-European, strongly contradicts a deeply agricultural language community and thus disqualifies the Anatolia hypothesis." So late Proto-Indo-European has 5 acceptable roots referring to agriculture. And I would just like to point out that, again, the seed roots have variable meanings, wheat, barley, a variety of other things. And so we can't really say what any one of these roots referred to, what kind of seed. But 2 of them contain a root for plow. There's a reference to a plow, and there's a reference to plowed field. And plows, as we are now realizing, I was just talking to Johannes Müller about this. He's recently co-authored a paper which goes over the evidence for the existence of ards in prehistoric Europe. and ARDs can be dated pretty confidently after 3600 BC. They might be there a little bit earlier, but like the wheels, we can tie this vocabulary to dated archaeological correlates after 3600 BC. And in addition to that, the European Neolithic founder crops, peas, chickpeas, beans, lentils, and flax, were named in Indo-European with words from non-Indo-European languages, which suggests that non-Indo-European populations had well-developed farming vocabularies that were borrowed into the Indo-European languages. So we put these two constraints together, 1 and 2 together. If the late Proto-Indo-European homeland is constrained to regions with wheeled vehicles, but with little or no evidence for agriculture as late as 3500 BC, we get the Pontic-Caspian steppes and northern Europe, the Baltic, and Scandinavia. That's where we're constrained to, after 3500 BC. Constraint number 3 is terminology for milk products. The late Proto-Indo-European roots for dairy, here they are, to milk. There's a word that probably means sour milk, a word that probably means buttermilk, a word that probably means cheese, and there's the basic word for cow, which is shared with Anatolian. Late Proto-Indo-European had multiple dairy foods just from the linguistic evidence. Early Proto-Indo-European did not attest these roots. It had another root for milk, and perhaps, therefore, a split before dairy foods were widespread in the Proto-Indo-European homeland. So what is the evidence, the archaeological evidence, that we can correlate with this vocabulary? This was a study published in Nature in 2021, authored by Siobhan Wilkin. I was a co-author, looking at dairy peptides preserved in human dental calculus for a variety of steppe individuals from different time periods. And as you can see on the left, those are E-Neolithic samples dated between 4500 and 4000 BC. Looking for dairy peptides, there's one individual from Falinsk who might have a dairy peptide, but this is contradicted by another aspect of the same individual. We can't be sure that that's really there. And on the right, Yamnaya dairy peptides in dental calculus, it's virtually ubiquitous throughout Yamnaya. They are drinking cow milk, they're drinking sheep and goat milk, and there's 2 individuals on the lower Don who have evidence for drinking horse milk, which is the earliest protein peptide evidence for horse milk consumption that has been developed so far, and certainly proves that horses were domesticated by this time. Nobody is going to try to go out and milk a wild horse, or they will only try it once. Constraint number 4 is horses and horseback riding. This is a complicated subject. I've given you an image there of Przewalski horses. Przewalski horses are, we now know, in the lineage, the genetic lineage Dom1, and are not related to modern domesticated horses, but they probably looked like them. And so I've given you another image from Maikop chieftain's grave, engraved on a silver vase, and you can see that that horse looks very much like a Przewalski horse. Now that horse in the North Caucasus should be a Dom2 horse. That's where Dom2 horses lived. But it probably looked very much like a Przewalski horse, the thick neck, the big head, and stocky body and short legs. If we're talking about Yamnaya people riding horses or Maikop people riding horses, this is probably the kind of horse that they were riding, or it looked like this. Now, I also participated in the Librado et al. Study of 2021, The Origins and Spread of Domesticated Horses from the Western Eurasian Steppes. Really a great paper, collected DNA data from hundreds of horses from contexts all the way across Europe and the steppes. But I did disagree with the way that the data was presented. Because in Librado et al., the main focus of the paper was the appearance of fully modern, genetically fully modern Dom2 horses at about 2200 BC, which you see there at the top. They did not arrange their visual data in this way. I cut it apart and rearranged it so I could make my point, which is that according to zoologists, domestication for any animal is a long-term process. Domestication goes through stages. So we should not think of animals as being either wild or domesticated. If we're looking at the process of domestication, we have to look at it as a continuum. So on one end of the continuum is the wild progenitor, and on the other end is fully genetically modern Dom2. We would expect to see a process of evolution between those 2 points, and that's what we're seeing here if we arrange the data this way. At the bottom is wild horses from sites in the North Caspian steppes that are dated about 5500 BC. These horses are found in a context with other wild animals. They're hunter-gatherer sites. There's no domesticates present. And for that reason, we can be pretty sure we're looking at the wild progenitor here. It's in the Dom2 clade. It forms a basal position in the Dom2 clade, but it's not domesticated. The next stage up, in the Eneolithic, in the Labrado et al. Paper, there were 2 samples dated between 4500 and 4000 BC that actually were found with domesticated cattle and sheep. That's an extremely important distinction. And that distinction was not made in the paper. At that time, and it looks to me also like there is a shift. There's only 2 samples, but it looks like there is a shift towards Dom2 status from the wild, the orange being what we're looking at, the growth of that orange bar. It looks like there's a shift towards Dom2, which you do not see in the horses from Pietrele in the lower Danube, in the Eneolithic Romania. And then in addition to that shift, in the Eneolithic, you see horsehead maces appearing for the first time. In the Eneolithic, you see horses being buried at, for instance, Falinsk, with humans in the same graves with domesticated cattle and sheep, in a context where no obviously wild animals are included in these graves. The only sacrifices in the Falinsk cemetery are horses, cattle, and sheep, and they occur in graves with humans. Also, you find at the site of Siogie, which is the same time period, horses laid out in head and hoof arrangements on top of graves, which is the same way that the domesticated cattle and the sheep are laid out ritually. So there's several pieces of evidence: the horsehead maces, the co-occurrence with cattle and sheep and humans in graves that exclude obviously wild animals, and the actual ritual layout of horses being the same as the ritual layout of domesticated cattle and sheep, that suggests that horses are moving off of the wild pole and towards the domesticated pole by 4500 BC. And then we have Yamnaya horses, which are 95% Dom2. They have almost all of the genetic shifts that you see in genetically modern Dom2 horses, but not quite all of them. And then finally, in about 2200 BC, we see the emergence of Dom2 horses, and it's clear that they were superior. They replace the earlier genetically not fully modern Dom2 horses very rapidly and spread all over Europe and Asia. So there was an improvement in those animals in 2200 BC that probably relates to genes for excitability and genes for tolerance of weight on the back and the lumbar region. Both of those are adaptations to living with humans and to being ridden. So the fully modern, genetically Dom-2 horses probably were capable of being ridden for longer periods of time without causing discomfort to the horse, and they were calmer than the horses had been before. Horses are still today extremely excitable animals. If you've worked with horses or been around them much, you realize how dangerous they are. They panic very rapidly, and the instinct to startle and then run as fast as you can is what kept them alive. That's their basic survival instinct. So it's hard to breed that instinct out of them. We still haven't completely done it today. I would imagine that Yamnaya horses were somewhat difficult to ride, skittish, nervous. And if the rider wanted to approach an aggressive threat, like a human advancing in battle, probably they dismounted in order to fight because the horse would run the other way. But that's still a huge advantage in herding, which is what I would want to emphasize rather than warfare. A mounted herder can manage 3 times more sheep than a pedestrian herder can. You can expand your herds by 3 times without increasing the labor demands at all. But once you expand your herds that size, then you have to keep them moving if you're not foddering them. All of the evidence is that these horses were not being foddered. So once you get larger herds, you have to keep feeding them by moving them to new pastures. Of course, the larger herds give you the wherewithal for producing a surplus that can be used in politics, in feasting, in loans, to increase your political status and the debt relationships that you have with those around you. And of course, we have the new paper by Troutman et al. Volker Hyde was a major contributor and organizer of that paper. 5 Yamnaya individuals dated between 3000 and about 2600 BC from Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary had 4 or more of 6 pathologies associated with Reiter's syndrome. And also, the earliest individual was the individual from Songrad, who also had 4 of those 6 pathologies and seems to have been a habitual rider. I know this is a surprise, and most people would say, no, that's impossible. But when you look at the Neolithic evidence for horse-head maces, horses being sacrificed with humans, a change in the way that humans are relating to horses by 4500 BC, it becomes not so surprising if someone is beginning to ride horses by the time of Songrad. And of course, that would give them a mobility that might explain why the people of the Berezhnovka ancestry were able to skip all the way across Ukraine without picking up any genetics from the North Pontic region and arrive in southeastern Europe carrying Lower Volga or CLV genetics. And of course, wagons and horseback riding were the 2 major technical requirements for the development of nomadic pastoralism. I have a reference at the bottom of this slide to a paper I've recently published in a volume edited by Christensen and Huskrunen, and it recently won just this week, won the Best Scientific Book Prize at the American Society for American Archaeology conference in New Orleans, which is a huge, I think, a wonderful result, and shows that my American colleagues are paying a lot of attention to what's going on in this room today. I can't give the entire argument for Yamnaya being the beginning, the people who invented nomadic pastoralism in the Eurasian steppes. That's contained in this article. But I do believe that there's substantial evidence that they were. There's evidence from the disappearance of settlements in the North Pontic region. This rapid expansion that David has just described of a single clan, what was it that drove their expansion? I believe that expansion can be explained because they invented a new economy, a highly mobile economy that is based on the combination of wagon transport, which allows you to transport your heavy residential needs anywhere you go, plus horseback riding, which greatly increased the size of the herds and therefore the value of animals in human economies from this point forward into the Bronze Age. As Amy Bogard has written in a variety of places, animals become really a different kind of currency in human societies from this point forward, and it's because ultimately of the invention of a new economy that was able to take advantage of the intervalley plains in the Eurasian grasslands. Before this, in the Neolithic, most occupation was confined to the rich river valleys, which are like narrow ribbons of high resources that go for hundreds of kilometers through a very low resource environment. And that the grasslands, people can't eat grass, the grasslands had been really underexploited before Yamnaya. And it's in Yamnaya that you begin to see cemeteries for the first time being placed, Kurgan cemeteries being placed out in the inter-river valley plains, which is the great majority of the Eurasian steppes. So by inventing this new nomadic economy, the Yamnaya people were able to harvest the bioenergy of the Eurasian grasslands for the first time in human history. And they had this huge niche open to them that they expanded into. They then exported that economy into environments that were really not that suitable for it. So we see corded ware people having 80% Yamnaya ancestry and attempting to expand this nomadic economy into a Europe that soon defeated that attempt ecologically. So there's a increase in mobility during corded ware, and it comes right back already in Bellbeaker to being a much more sedentary economy in Europe, which is not really suited for nomadic pastoralism the way the Eurasian steppes are. So those are the main constraints on identifying the Yamnaya expansion as the expansion that carried late Proto-Indo-European languages both eastwards to the Altai and westwards into Europe all the way ultimately to Scotland. In addition, now I didn't know what David was going to say, so I didn't know what to do here, but by 4500 BC, there are these three distinct genetic clines in the Pontic-Caspian steppes, and one, CLV, as we've just heard, is linked to both Yamnaya origins. Yamnaya is 80% CLV ancestry, the number one cline there, and to Hittite genetics, and therefore to early Proto-European as well. I don't know how to put a probability on an Eastern or a Western entry into Anatolia. Right now, I'm right here. It's. You tip to the eastern side. Yeah. Well, I haven't tipped to the eastern side yet. I'm right 50-50, looking for more evidence. I'm actually toying with the if. Here, I'll just say this one thing to end. Is this the pointer? Yes. If, and there's debate about this, but in the archives of Ebla, 2350 BC, there are these names that are not normal for the region and which have been identified as early Indo-European Anatolian branch names. There's controversy about whether these are really Anatolian names or not, but at 2350 BC, it's hundreds of years before the Hittites. And the place where they show up is right here in Cilicia, the men of army, A-R-M-I. If there were Anatolian speakers down here in this corner of Anatolia in 2350 BC, how did they get there? What they're doing is quite clear. If you read the archives of Ebla, there's a Harvard dissertation by Winters, 2019, it's available. It's fascinating. He goes through the whole archives of Ebla and their contents. And it's clear that what was happening is that Ebla was down here, They were getting all of their silver from the men of army. The army was their #1 trade partner in the north. Silver from Anatolia was coming down to Ebla, and from Ebla was being distributed to Mesopotamia. This is the best choke point in the richest trade in the ancient world at the time. If you want to get rich, that's where you want to be. Right in between the source of the silver and the buyers of the silver in Mesopotamia, and that's where the men of army were. They also were extremely interested in equids. They're being given local equids and equid control, whips, that kind of thing, by the local officials. If they are Anatolian speakers, they're kind of close to these two sites where we have genetic evidence for people with CLV ancestry. So just putting dots together on a map, if men of army are here and we have genetic evidence for CLV steppe-based people at those two sites, and at one of them it's before it's EB2. One of them is EB2. It could be 2500, could easily be 2350 BC, contemporary with the men of army. I'm even considering, and this is just total speculation, so I'll probably embarrass myself. I'm even considering a southern entry. This is how open I am. On the Crimea, there are several hoards of metalwork, really rich hoards of metalwork from the Eastern Mediterranean side, metalwork, dated to about 2400 BC. Could they be in ships coming all the way around and coming up from the southern coast? I'm just saying that, putting these dots together on a map. I'm even thinking about that maybe they arrived by sea. Tacitus, the Roman historian, said that the Germans were indigenous to, in his Germania, that the Germans were indigenous to Germany. And you knew that because in ancient times, he said, all large migrations came from the sea. I think he was thinking about the Greeks, but it's true. That's how the Greeks colonized the Black Sea and southern Italy. And the shores of Germany the seas were so dark and violent that nobody could land there. And therefore, nobody ever came into Germany, and that's the argument, that the Germans were indigenous there. Of course, the argument can't be accepted, but the observation that he had, that in ancient times, all major migrations came from the sea, is kind of interesting, that idea was there in a guy who lived in 100 AD. So in terms of how we get Indo-European languages from the steppes into Anatolia, I think we're still, at least in my mind, we're still wide open. Eastern entry is certainly possible. Western entry is possible. I'm even playing with the southern entry. But I think that archaeologists should be comfortable with saying that a Proto-Indo-European, late Proto-Indo-European can be correlated with Yamnaya and the Yamnaya expansion. It's not an assumption. We're not making some sort of an assumption that genetics are being reduced, biology is being reduced to language, or language is being reduced to biology. It's not a reductionist argument at all. There's logical boxes that we can constrain where Proto-Indo-European was spoken. And once we accept that Yamnaya expansion is the expansion of at least late Proto-Indo-European languages, then we have available to us the vocabulary, which is what has always driven me, is to have the equivalent of a text projected into a world without texts. And with that text, we can understand at a much higher level the kinds of questions we're grappling with today about gender, about ideology, about the role of male warrior bands. And we ought to be using those resources, and I hope that we can feel more comfortable with using them and applying them to things like the genetic data that you've just heard today. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Very interesting. Questions?
Thank you, David, for this rich presentation, linking up with archaeology and Indo-European linguistic origins, and the potential, not least, by doing that for future research. Now, you had an argument about riding horses and sheep and things like that. Now, I think it's fairly clear now, also from the book, that a wool textile economy did not prevail in temperate Europe from the steppe to the west and east until after 2000 BC. There may have been import textile, yes, but so therefore it's not the wool economy that would be important in the third millennium. And also, even if you had sheep for other reasons, and there are many other reasons to have them, there would also be sheepdogs.
Yes.
So, in a way, wouldn't the horse then be more suitable for other herds like cows, or I don't know, but or couldn't the sheepdog then rather do the job than the horse riders?
It's true that a pedestrian herder with a dog can manage many more sheep than a pedestrian herder without a dog, but a mounted herder with a dog can manage even more sheep. So I don't think it's an either or of dogs or horses. As far as the economy being a cattle economy, I don't believe that the Yamnaya economy was a cattle economy. It's a difficult thing to address as there are very few Yamnaya settlements, and of course, if you really want to know what the economy is rather than what ritual animals are placed in graves, then you have to have settlements. And in the entire Volga region, we initially went to the Volga, Dory and I, years ago, excavating together, looking for Yamnaya settlements. I wanted to excavate a Yamnaya settlement, and we couldn't find them. And we used Western techniques for looking for low-density sites, close interval shovel testing in places that are ecologically promising, that are used by pastoralists today, and they had no evidence of archaeological remains on the surface. And we found herding camps. We found Bronze Age herding camps, and I'm proud that we did that. But they were late Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age. Early Bronze Age Yamnaya, they were so mobile that it's, you know, a site is going to consist of 5 sherds that are 30 centimeters under the grass and dispersed over a large area. We don't have the methods to find sites like that. And so we ended up not being able to analyze a Yamnaya settlement. But most of the animals in Yamnaya graves are sheep. 90% of the animals in Yamnaya graves are sheep. The isotopes that are in humans that have been analyzed by Rick Schulting for our Yamnaya sample near Samara suggest that they were eating sheep products, very high nitrogen. The sheep are also very high nitrogen. It doesn't fit with the cattle. Also, there's a variety of different milks, mainly sheep milk or goat milk that's documented in the dental calculus. So I don't think it's a well-supported statement to say that it's mainly cattle pastoralism in Yamnaya. There's certainly a lot of evidence for sheep.
No question from my side, but a question from someone who's following on YouTube, a guy called Alvaro Tirado Moreno. How does and I think there's a question to both Davids here, how does the rapine culture fit in all this of the genetic expansion here of Yamnaya or genetic origins of Yamnaya? So any thoughts about rapine culture in the whole context?
Okay, so Repin is a site on the Don, the lower Don. It's in the steppes. It has 80% horse bones. This is just, you know, what are you going to do with that? That's not cattle or sheep. It's regarded as, it's dated about 3400 BC, the same time as our earliest evidence for core Yamnaya genetics at Mikhailovka. Mikhailovka contains about 10% Repin sherds. The Repin site is a unicultural site. There's all one kind of pottery. That kind of pottery is called Repin pottery. And you kind of find it in small percentages in Yamnaya sites on the Don and the Dnieper. At Mikhailovka, which is one of the few Yamnaya settlements that's really well documented, there's about 10% rep insureds in the level 2. At Mikhailovka, level 1 is pre-Yamnaya, level 2 is early Yamnaya, level 3 is late Yamnaya. There's about 10% rep insureds in level 2, which is where we got the tooth from that gave the earliest core Yamnaya genetics. Repin I see as a pottery style that developed on the Don, and then you see pottery like that in a variety of different early Yamnaya graves dated to that before 3000 BC era, which is a minority of Yamnaya sites, but there are Yamnaya sites that are dated before 3000 BC, and Repin sherds show up in them. I don't see it as a culture, I see it as a pottery type.
Laszlo Bartoszewicz. I'm not being a linguist. All I can say, I'm a native Finno-Ugric speaker. But I was wondering already during the other lecture by the other David, are there any tangible correlates between the genetic patterns that you see in this process that you emphasized in general and the linguistic record? Namely, for example, if I understood correctly, the sexual differences detectable by genetics seem to be more gender balanced, and now I slip into gender talk. Are there any gendered aspects of the linguistics which is seen as parallel to all these developments?
So there's a long tradition in linguistics, and probably you, Gus, should be answering this question, but there's a long tradition in linguists of trying to reconstruct the kinship system of the speakers of Proto-Indo-European, and is it Omaha? It's a patrilineal system, in which inheritance of important things like animals would be through the male line. It's not surprising patrilineality has been supposed on the basis of a variety of evidence and archaeological evidence really throughout Europe, including for Neolithic farmers. It doesn't distinguish Yamnaya from Neolithic farmers, really. But most pastoralists are patrilineal. There's very few that are not. The reason for that normally is given by ethnographers as that pastoralism is dangerous. Unlike farming, your primary critical resource is very easily stolen, particularly if you're a cattle and horse pastoralist. The resource has legs. And if you're a farmer, your grain does not have legs. It's very difficult to steal, and it's very heavy. So pastoralists throughout the world are warlike because they're constantly stealing each other's animals. And therefore you have to defend your animals from thieves. And therefore brothers stay together in order to defend their common wealth, and they stay with their father, and that generates a very, very common pattern of patrilineality. So both violence and a patrilineal inheritance tend to be associated with pastoralism, and I would expect the same for Yamnaya.
Yeah, Sven Hansen, thank you for your talk. I was very much surprised to learn that Yamnaya is a kind of exploding clan. And now you spoke about the horse, the wagon, and the cheese. Where is the archaeological evidence for these things in the Sredni Stok area or whatever? And I mean, this is what I showed. We have the cheese already in the 5th millennium in the Caucasus. This is very general what you explained, but where is the real link between your linguistic reconstructions, the wheel and so on, with this exploding clan? Where is the material evidence?
Well, I would say it's the development of nomadic pastoralism, and the arguments for this are really presented in the new volume. But one of the dramatic Yamnaya comes in as a dramatic archaeological horizon in the steppes, just in the steppes. Because before, in the Eneolithic, in the river valleys, there were stratified settlements. There are stratified Eneolithic settlements in the Volga River Valley, in the Don, in the Dnieper, and they've been excavated for decades. And almost all of those settlements are abandoned during the Yamnaya period. It's, as I was just saying, it's almost impossible to find a settlement of any kind on the Volga, which is an area where you did have sites like Varfolomievka, which are mainly in the Cyrillic literature, that are stratified, radiocarbon dated, had domesticated animals. And these river valley sites are good for stratified accumulation. They're riverbank sites, you know, with accumulation of deep stratigraphies. And at the top is the end of the Eneolithic, and bang, there is a blank for Yamnaya. Then you pick up the archaeological evidence at these same settlements, again in the late Bronze Age. But early Yamnaya and middle Bronze Age catacomb, there's almost very few settlements, except in the catacomb you begin to see them up in the forest steppe, but even then not in the steppe. So you have to explain this sudden change in settlement pattern. It comes at the same time as the introduction of wheeled vehicles and the combination of wheeled vehicles and horseback riding, and the evidence for no milk before, ubiquitous milk after. So there's a dramatic change in diet that goes along with that. Huge simplification of the economy. Yamnaya was a very simple economy, a lot of milk products and meat. And before that, in the Eneolithic, the economy was quite complex from these stratified settlements. Some domesticated animals, a lot of wild deer, aurochs, a lot of fishing. So it combined almost everything in various proportions in different settlements. And Yamnaya comes in and everything is simplified. And that simplified economy gave them the ability to harvest the bioenergy of the grasslands. And so that's the evidence, is a change in diet, change in settlement pattern, introduction of new technologies.
Esther Banfi. Thank you, David, for this brilliant perspectives. I could have 100 questions, but I have one about the dairy products. You showed two charts, one about the Chalcolithic, one about the Yamnaya, based on evidence gained on peptids in dental calculus. The Chalcolithic picture it could be anywhere in the Neolithic before, because as we know, among others from Evershed et al. 2022 paper, that it did occur from the very beginning of the Neolithic, albeit in small amounts, because as we know, they were lactose intolerant. Yeah. My question is, based on this paramount increase of ubiquitous, as you say, of milk or dairy products consumption, that contrasted to the earlier phase, as we thought that they could be fermented products, mainly dry cheese or whatever, storable. Could this be a phase towards the phase of the lactose-tolerant period? Could they be just drinking raw milk or milk, not just fermented products?
I don't think they had the genes for lactose tolerance yet, so I would assume they're fermented milk products, cheese and yogurt. Yeah, and yeah, I didn't mean to say that there's no dairy in other parts of the world. But in the steppes, there's no dairy or very little evidence for dairy in the E-Neolithic, and it becomes ubiquitous only with Yamnaya. It's late. I think that's a point you're making. The steppes were very delayed in their adoption of dairy foods in comparison to other parts of the Old World. Yeah.
Okay. Last question.
Thank you. I'm Rasmus Bjørn from Jena. I'm a linguist. And this talk about dairy is actually really interesting, especially, and that's something we're not looking at when we traditionally discuss linguistics, is we look just at Indo-European. But Indo-European was just one language, and there were other language groups, and some of them we know, and especially in the Caucasus, we still have evidence of the languages that probably were spoken there in this point in time as well. And incidentally, the word that you showed for cheese in core Indo-European has very similar words in the Caucasian languages. So we need to look at this as the dynamics between different cultures and not just something happening in the steppes, of course, but they're adopting. And if you go look at my poster, you can also see that the Indo-European word for cow has very obvious similarities with words in Southwest Asia, where we're pretty sure that the cow came from by some vector. So thank you.
And I just want to say at the end that it's a great privilege to be here and be alive and working in this material at this time, and particularly with my colleague David Reich. It's unbelievable data that has come out of our collaboration, and I just feel like we're beginning to enter a new era in the archaeological understanding of the past by integrating all of these fields. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Let's have a coffee break until 11:15 or 5 past? Okay, 11:05. And then we look forward to Christiansen's talk. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to pick up with the last keynote lecture by Professor Christian Christiansen on pandemics and migration, the Neolithic quarterware transition in Northern Europe. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to, by way of introduction, just say that I use the word and the term the Neolithic decline several times. And this is, and I want to stress here that there has been an ongoing discussion over the past maybe 15 years at least, maybe longer, about a Neolithic decline, also before we had the genetic revolution and the genetic results. And that a decline, of course, assumes that there was also a decline from something that was better. And the Neolithic decline discussion is confined to temperate Europe, basically. And is confined to the 4th millennium. And it takes us its starting point that by the mid-4th millennium, during the 4th millennium, you see a kind of climax of Neolithic social organization unfolding very differently east and west. To the west, you have the climax of huge megaliths, megalithic architecture, farming societies, highly hierarchical ranked societies. To the east, and in East Central Europe into Ukraine, you have a completely different kind of society, but also highly organized mega settlements, like in the Tupolev culture. So what you see there is really a very, very successful and thriving Neolithic, what we could term Neolithic here, societies with quite a lot of variation between East and West. And why should they then begin to decline, and what were the signs of decline? I think the term the decline was introduced by our colleague, the Polish colleague Janusz Kruk, and in a book 20 years ago in Polish about it. I adopted the term and have been used it frequently ever since. And what it points to really is that by the end of the 4th millennium, even if the 4th millennium, as we have heard from Sven, it was a millennium of major innovations, wheel, wagon, metal technology, and so on. So why should there become a decline? It's not obvious. At the time before the genetic revolution, the arguments revolved around there could have been a climate change. We see farming contracting, the northern edge of farming moving south, hunting fish societies expanding. So that's one aspect of the crisis. Another aspect is a gradual decline and termination of the big mega sites of the Tupolev. And in the West, we see also signs of crisis and end of megalithic architecture. And in a way, before the genetic revolution, Yamnaya and Corded were seen as kind of crisis solutions to this decline, adapting a much more decentralized economy that were more suited to in these new environmental climatic conditions. Now, obviously, all of that changed after 2015, when we learned that we have these major migrations. But then, of course, it raised a whole series of new questions. What came first? The Neolithic decline, or were the migrations? What is cause? What is effect? And here we are at the heart of the problem we grapple with in archaeology to establish cause and effect between phenomena. And I will now move into that and just outline a few of those discussions that's taking place after 2015. Now, I have to get this moving. I do it here.
No, maybe just this.
Ah, there we have it. Okay, that one. Okay. So when we look at the cold wet transition, which I would concentrate on here, we have at least 3 competing explanations, and we have heard several of them. There is a climate change, there is a food crisis following, leading to demographic decline in the late 4th millennium BC. Then following the presentation of the papers in Nature in 2015, in the same year, we also published a paper that showed that the plague was actually 5,000 years old. And could that be part of an explanation of demographic decline? Then there was, of course, the power of a new pastoral social organization, as we have been discussing. There is a demographic power here, maybe also a social power that is expansive by its very nature, that I will also look very briefly into. Also, I would like here just to go back and reminisce a little bit, and Martin will remember, because when we were in Copenhagen, had finalized, I think, our work on the Nature paper, of the Allentoft et al. Paper, we were having a meeting sitting around the table, and at that time there had just been publications 1 or 2 years earlier both by the Shannon group of all these summed C14 curves, and a similar group from Kiel, also taken in northern Germany, Scandinavia, and they all sort of showed the same, that there was a real steep decline in the curves by the end of the 4th millennium. And we presented the data. We were sitting, the archaeology group and the genetic group, around the table, and we were discussing, there were debates. We had also a seminar with Steve Shannon and so on, how to interpret these curves. And they preferred a demographic explanation. Others had other explanations and doubted if it could be that, and it would rather be something else, a change of economy, climate change, and so on. And we said around the table, okay, let's try see if we can test it. If it is demography, then there would surely have been some kind of pandemic ongoing, because this is all over Europe, what they show. Can we test that? And we looked at Martin and the geneticist at the table, and Simon and Martin went back and into the laboratory and tested for plague, and they found it. What I want to say here is, this is the way that things work when you are truly interdisciplinary. You sit around the same table and exchange ideas. And I also want to stress, ideas not only come from geneticists, ideas also go from archaeologists formulating hypotheses, and we throw them back to the geneticist. And this is really, in a way, the dynamics of being interdisciplinary. I just wanted to point out here, because this whole conference is about that, the way we exchange ideas here between disciplines. So let's move on and try the arguments a little bit. So first, there is a demographic model we have discussed, and that we forwarded in the paper also in 2017. That has been debated, and also what David Anthony has been stressing here. We have not only linguistic but also written evidence. And it's very clear that you have a special social organization linked to these step societies, Indo-European societies, that has an inbuilt social dynamic where sons are trained to become warriors, herders, colonists, and have to move out if they want to have a better future than working for their oldest brother. And apparently a lot of them preferred to move and colonize. So there is an inherent demographic, social force here that is part of the equation. Whether it's enough, that's another question. Then, of course, there is I have just shown you one diagram here, but we all know this from the paper in 2013 and the Hingst et al. Paper as well. You have this incredible bust by the end of the fourth millennium, all over temperate Europe. And what were the causes? And that's still not, there's no final answer to that, but it initiated a lot of research, and that is really what it's all about and what makes it fun. So there were the same group. They came out with explanations about early signs of crisis. They thought they could demonstrate in Neolithic societies across Europe. European Neolithic societies showed early warning signals of population collapse. So they tried to show that there were things happening in climate, environment, and in farming yields that were going down that would then lead to a population collapse. Then there were other studies about a recent one by the Johannes Müller group, where they studied selected areas and tried to show that dynamics were actually variable, and there were variable explanations. And if you had a population collapse in one region, you would often see an increase in a neighboring region. So they preferred to say, okay, it's more complex. People move, yes, and there are collapses, yes, but in some regions they also then increase. And population decline did not mean the end of everything, as you can see from this paper from the Bronze Age, which I just want to show. You have the end of the European Bronze Age. You had an incredible climatic event, 800 BC, and it did not lead to population collapse. So there's no obvious causal connection between climate change and population collapse. As we have discussed earlier, climatic change will always favor certain economic strategies and be a disadvantage for others. Others may suffer, but some may win from it. Depends on where you are in Europe in relation to the climate. So basically speaking, none of these studies could sort of confirm or explain the graphs. We had then this, I thought, a very interesting study that came rather recently, also from Jankola and the group, where they went really into a very careful study of regional evidence from Central Europe on demographic development and environmental change, taking in all the pollen diagram, the environmental evidence, and they showed there was this period, and they narrow it down to between 3,300, 3,000 to 2,900 BC, where there is a decline, and you see it in the environmental evidence as well. So it looks, and of course, we also know we have the plateau of the calibration curve here, so it's very difficult to narrow it down very precisely. Was it 3,100 to 3,000 or 3,300 to 3,100? I'm not a specialist here, but I have understood that it's difficult to make the window, the chronological window, very narrow here. So we say late 4th millennium down to around 3,000 BC where climaxes. So what we can say here is that at least that's my conclusion, that demographic and environmental evidence is inconclusive in terms of establishing cause and effect for what we term the Neolithic decline. In some regions, the bust started earlier than in others. How would that correlate with a rapid pandemic, if that's what we're looking for? And we have the Müller et al. There are interactions, regional interactions between boom and bust. And then finally, steppe migration seemed to start sometime after this decline phase. And they were also subject to plague. In fact, the first paper on plague was confined to Yamnaya and Cote d'Ivoire. And so why should they not suffer? Why were they able to expand demographically and still having be accompanied by plague? There may be some explanations for that. And now we have the concert here. Maybe we should enjoy it? Okay. So the conclusion so far is that there are signs of a Neolithic decline. I think that is for sure over wider regions, but they precede the steppe migrations. And there's no strong indication of a single internal cause. Then in 2018, again, a group here from Copenhagen published a paper where we for the first time were able to document an earlier version of plague, as it were the mother of later plagues, located in the late TRB in a passage grave in western Sweden. So suddenly you had the plague brought back further back in time before the steppe migrations. And we observed also here in that paper, or those who worked on this, that there were a number of strains developing quite rapidly after each other here. And I remember I had a discussion with Johannes Krause. He just published a paper at that time where he had studied the Black Death and the various strains. And he started with one shared strain, and then over time, quite rapidly, developed new strains, leading to different outbreaks in different places, which shows it was very contagious and was quite widespread in the population. That's what produces these mutations, as we have also learned from Corona. So there were some similarities, it seems to us at the time, between this Neolithic plague and the way it unfolded and the Black Death. But obviously, and we also had a hypothesis about its origin, and this is clearly a hypothesis. We hypothesized that the mega settlements in Tripoli was the ideal place, thousands of people crammed together, and animals and garbage. I remember that Johannes Krause called it speculation in his comments. I take that as a compliment, because we need to speculate, we need to hypothesize to move things further, and we need to sometimes be a bit bold. So that what we were here. And of course, we try to link it to this whole horizon, as has been so well documented by the Sven Hansen Group of Innovations and others, Wheel and Wagon and so on and so forth. But we also thought that maybe the decline of the Tripoli could be linked to this onset of the plague at the time, but we had no we had not conclusive evidence here. It remained a hypothesis. Of course, critique came. In this paper here, and the critique was mainly directed towards the deadly implications of this early form plague. This early form of plague is phenomenon plague. It means it goes from human to human. And how should that have spread if it was so deadly? Today, it's incredibly deadly, that form of plague. You will die within 24 hours, more or less, if you don't get a vaccination against it. So they argued here, the authors here, that the Neolithic plague was not so deadly. And they say here, absence of this mutation in the gene have compromised the dissemination capacities of it. And our data do not support the scenario of a prehistoric phenomic plague pandemic. So we had, to get our act together, and in Copenhagen, Martin Sikura here started his incredible big project and work on collecting more data and working on this. What we did in our project, we had a project at the time also with Goose and others. We collected evidence, more evidence from two very well documented modern excavations of megaliths. One was Buri in the Paris Basin, where several hundred individuals were buried, and it's incredibly well excavated, well dated, well analyzed by Lars Hanova and Philippe Chambon. And the other one was the Gökheim passage grave in western Sweden, who had been very carefully excavated by Carl-Johan Sjögren and his team. And they have done a lot of work on that. And there were 60 individuals in that, and that was in a very brief time frame for maybe 100, 150 years. And we set out, and I can say what I'll present now here in the following is under publication. But first, there was this paper by Martin in the recent pre-publication of pathogen throughout Eurasia. And there, one important aspect was that he had so many more cases of plague. Now, the plague and also early forms of plague would be documented from the Lake Baikal in the east to a passage grave in the Orkney Islands to the far, northwest of Europe. Several thousand of kilometers within a very, very short time period. This is what I would call a pandemic. And Martin, he explained in this text that it challenges previous interpretations that the early plague strains represent only isolated zoonotic spillovers, because that was what they argued in the previous paper, that there were these localized, but they were localized and they never spread outside their local area. Here we can see there is a global distribution over a very short period of time. But to understand that and to understand the mechanisms behind it and how it impacted, we surely needed to go into the detail. We needed case studies. And that's what we did with the two megaliths, where we have been working on over the last several years, and we are now in the final stages of publication. Also, Martin had this diagram here, which showed, and he made these calculations of also the spread and the timing, and where the earliest and how does it spread. And my understanding is, and Martin will have to supplement eventually later, that it was an east to west spread, reaching near. It started early on, and 6,000 BP, and it would reach then Europe, Neolithic Europe, around 3,300 to 3,100 BC. That's the window of the chronological window we have right now. To trace the demographic effects, as I said, we then the team here then analyzed several hundred individuals, as I said, from Bury in France, from Gökheim in western Sweden, and we also provide a circumstantial evidence to document possible demographic effects. These are the two megaliths. They are located with some 100 kilometers between them. So they are both hit by the Neolithic plague, more or less at the same time. Bury in France a little earlier, maybe around 3200 BC. Gökheim maybe 100, 150 years later. We have in that study also been able to reconstruct family groups. I will not go into that, but it shows in Gökheim that there are within a period of, was it 4 to 5 generations, Martin? Within we have 4 to 5 generations documented in family groups there. During that period, and nearly 20% have documented plague bacteria. And we know also from when Johannes Krause has analyzed Black Death cemeteries, he say that he can only get, even if we know all died from plague, but he will only be able to document maybe 25% with the plague bacteria. So this suggests that most of the people buried in that megalith would probably have had the plague. But during that short period of time, it developed 3 different strains, which again shows it must have been incredibly contagious. There must have been a really very active bacterial environment to cause these rapid mutations. And also the evidence, and again, this is not my field of research, but the evidence studied by Martin suggested that one of the strains had the characteristica, the Istinum had the characteristica of a deadly strain. So here it seems clear also that maybe even the family who had that strain, they would seem to have died more or less at the same time. So at least here in Gökheim, one of the strains was very deadly. That's what the evidence suggests. And it was prevalent. We have also neighboring megaliths where it was studied. It was also in southern Sweden. There was an individual in the buried there who came from southern Sweden and brought the deadly variety of it. So it would seem here that it was really widespread in the late phase of these TRB societies in Sweden and Denmark. Moving on. Oh yeah, here we have, you see from the excavation, And I cite from the paper here that we can only speculate on the impact of the disease, but it has all the hallmarks expected in a swift and deadly epidemic. The frequency of plague positive, the disease is restricted to the last 2 generations, and all higher coverage genomes from this subfamily are identical. These are the arguments from the paper, that this final strain was very deadly. Now over to Buri. Here again we have in this megalith a rather short-lived phase of burials towards the end of the 4th millennium. And again, there are several family groups that I will not go into. But what we can show here is also that it is reused again 300-400 years later from around 2800. And what we also can show in the evidence is that the population that then buried their dead 300 years later is not a genetic continuation of the previous population. And if there are any continuation, then there are very few and weak links. It is, on the whole, a new population that has moved into the region, which also would suggest that it had a quite deadly impact. Again here, there were 2 forms of plague. An early form similar to the one we have talked about, and a later more derived form also in phase 2, actually. But despite their geographical distance, 1,500 kilometers, these early forms, this deadly form plague seems to be very similar. Again, we have apparently a very rapid spread over a very wide region. But how would we then be able to document the impact of the deadly impact on Neolithic societies? What we did here, we collaborated with pollen botanists, and we asked them to reanalyze a series of pollen diagrams from southern Sweden and from Denmark. And okay, there was one argument here I should add before going to that. Mortality profiles in the collective burials in northern France and Germany demonstrate a major demographic event in the late 4th millennium. This is a result of research carried out by Philippe Chambon and Laura Salanova. So not only in Buri do we have this, there's an overrepresentation of non-adult age groups over 5 years, and it suggests a rapid increase in the population, brutally ending around 3100 BCE. And collective graves from other areas in Europe offer a similar pattern. It's not a singular, but it's a widespread pattern. In Germany, the Gallery-Gräber from Hessen and Westphalia and the Totenhütten from Saxony and Thuringia shows an interruption of burials at the end of the 4th millennium, as recently emphasized. So we have here a wider geographical phenomenon similar to what is so well documented in Buri. And the obvious question is, can this be linked again to a deadly pandemic, even if you only have the evidence from Buri of the plague bacteria? And to analyze that, we mobilized evidence from pollen diagrams and from end dates of passage graves from South Scandinavia and Northern Europe, to see if we can trace signals of demographic decline. And indeed, that was the case. From pollen diagrams in South Scandinavia And this was done by Ralph Fife and Morten Fischer Mortensen for Denmark, and for Ralph for Scania. It can indeed be demonstrated in the pollen diagrams that there is widespread and systematic evidence of forest regrowth around 50-50, 3100 BC. It indicates that fields and grazing lands, as well as settlements, were given up. And this can only be explained by a substantive population decline that lasted a few hundred years. And we have similar evidence from northern Germany from pollen diagrams. And I show here, okay, not that one, maybe here. From northern Germany here, from Johannes Müller's recent publication, but also summarized in our paper, I think, in our Indo-European book. We see again this steep decline in megaliths and forest regrowth. So, Albert, you talked yesterday about a hiatus, a decline or a termination of in Switzerland around 3200, 3100 BC, and it was a termination of trade in flint with the Paris Basin. Here is your explanation. They died, or at least they got the plague. And the effects would be far-reaching, even down the whole way down to Switzerland. They couldn't provide the flint any longer because the traders had died. Probably. And also, we asked our colleagues who have been excavating and reconstructing megaliths over the last 30 years, Sven Hansen and Torben Dehn. This is another Sven than our Sven here. I can say that Sven Hansen is a very common Danish name. And there you have actually, they have collected for a whole series of passage graves, birch bark that they used between the stones when they made dry walls to make them stable. So this is a very precise date, and the date shows here, in conclusion, that architecture, the building of the complex passage grave ended abruptly. There's no one constructed after. The latest is 2950, most end 3000 BC. And it's all over South Scandinavia. They simply lose the capacity. And what does it mean when you lose the capacity to build passage graves so suddenly? Well, the architects died, the laborers dies. Or, if you want to go into social contradictions, you could suggest there was a revolution, but would a revolution go from France and the whole way up to Scandinavia? So the suggestion here is really that there is a total end of megalithic construction over the whole of northern Europe, 3000 BC. And they don't use them until several hundred years later. So what we have here, in my opinion at least, is that with all the circumstantial evidence and the very detailed high-resolution evidence of a very rapid development of different strains of plague, and one of them having the characteristics of being deadly, and it's a pandemic from Siberia to the Orkneys, spreading over this wide region. It must have been an incredibly deadly demographic disaster over wide regions. I'm not saying that it had the same impact everywhere. We know from the Black Death it could have different impact. Some regions, half the population died. In other regions, less died. And we know also that societies that were decentralized or spread out in the landscape, they suffered less. Sami population in Scandinavia suffered much less than, of course, urban populations. That's clear. And here we may have also an explanation why Kortewar and Yamnaya didn't suffer that much, because they were smaller, decentralized groups on the run, and therefore they could more easily cope with it, and the effects would not be so disastrous as when a Tupolia mega settlement of 5,000 inhabitants was hit. So we have these incredibly well-organized Neolithic societies of the fourth millennium. And there is really no plausible way to explain why they suddenly should collapse and come to an end. I can only see a plausible explanation being a deadly pandemic that would reduce their populations maybe by 40–50%, because they became unable to carry out their business as they used to. They were unable to till their fields. They were unable to build their megaliths. They lost skills. They lost the capacity to produce fine decorated pottery. That ends at the same time and is replaced by simple pottery. This is what you call, in other later periods, a dark age. When you lose skills because you lose populations, you use knowledge, you use the capacity to produce the culture, the social organization, and the technologies that you once mastered. The Neolithic societies were not in crisis, I would suggest. But they were hit much more strongly by the Neolithic plague than the steppe societies. They had a competitive advantage in their social organization that made them the winners demographically and socially. So the Neolithic decline is really a dark age. And it would only be by the migration, steppe migrations, that we would have a new period of expansion and demographic growth. We would have a new period, climax of barrow construction, deforestation, creating open grazing lands, and new rituals and new pottery traditions. And in between, we have this, what must have been a terrible period in European history. But it opened a window of opportunity, because we also know from later plagues, the Justinian plague, the Black Death, it also had positive effects. It flattened social hierarchies. It enabled new initiatives, gave more room to those who survived, and to create new ways of life. And the steppe migrations offered an attractive alternative. I think also we should consider here the possibility that when the plague hit and people started to die, this obviously is also a crisis, a crisis of religion. Why are the gods not protecting us? And there you then see an alternative social organization, more flat, more decentralized, an attractive alternative to a hierarchical society in crisis. So it opened up for the steppe migrations and a new social economic order. And after 2600, it then resulted in a more hybrid culture that merged Neolithic and steppe-derived economies and religions in Scandinavia. And I mention here again, I think religion is important here, and we haven't studied and related it to this yet, but we have these mythologies of the Vanya that first were at war, the fertility gods of the Vanya and the warrior gods of the Aesir, and they were at war, but then they made peace and exchanged hostages and created a new type of society and a new religion. Could that eventually be traced back to this terrible period of a Neolithic Dark Age here? Whatever happened or how people reacted, steppe social organization remained dominant. And with that also demographic, genetic, and linguistic dominance. So I think we should therefore re-evaluate later social transformations in the light of this evidence. And I would also predict that now we have sampled east-west, but we haven't sampled so much to the south. But if we look to say the Balkans and Greeks and other areas, to my knowledge, there's also a termination of settlements at the same time. So I would predict that we should be able to show that the plague not was only east-west over several thousand kilometers, but even expanded further south. But that would be for future research. But finally, I would say that we have also studied the effects of the Justinian plague, and that will appear in a forthcoming paper. And there you see the same signals in the pollen diagrams and reforestation. So there is a regularity here that seems that we apparently can link to the effects of pandemics. So my take-home message really is pandemics had disastrous demographic effect already from the Neolithic onwards. And that introduced a new layer of explanations in later European prehistory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Questions?
Sven Hansen. Thank you, Christian, for this vivid picture. I just wanted to remark in the south, the fourth millennium is empty. Yeah, in the lower Danube region, in Bulgaria, Greece, we do not have many settlements, and this is 1,000 years earlier empty than.
It's earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, something to look into.
Hi, Anna Thornberg. Thank you for an interesting talk, Christian. Something that is sort of that considers me regarding this, and especially when it comes to Joachim example, is that I know that the demography of Joachim, for example, rather reflects successive burials than catastrophe mortality. And also, if there are like 4 or 5 generations of individuals in this grave,
yeah.
And all of them would have died from plague, then there must have been recurring outbreaks of plague, since not all of them could have lived at the same time. Yes. And that would mean that the population must have been enormous, since there are a lot of studies in demographics that suggest that for this kind of lethal infection to actually sustain and reoccur, it takes a population of at least 5,000 individuals in a very limited area. So how do you think the demographics in Falbygden would look like at this time period?
Yeah, I agree with you that Neolithic populations Neolithic societies were populous, and we can see it in the pollen diagrams that they had rather big, stable areas for farming and some for grazing.
They were highly capable. The strain they develop over time, of course, show that there are always some who survive. I suggest also maybe that the Yamnaya and the steppe people already had, maybe, I'm not a specialist in immunity, but some may evolve immunity. I would rather hand this question over to Martin about the strains and the, if you feel like it.
Yeah, no, I think we do have, we certainly have evidence for at least 3 different strains that are present. 2 of them are actually quite closely related, so they might be part of sort of a broader outbreak. But there's also evidence it's actually an individual that's not in the pedigree, that's a little bit earlier, of a more basal strain. So there is certainly evidence for repeated introduction of different lineages into that area at least. And it kind of we can link it a little bit further south to another case from Denmark. So I do think clearly they must have had multiple waves of epidemics coming through. As to the question of where, like across the whole pedigree, I mean, in particular that one last strain that Christian mentioned, that's the one that's really in the sort of last generation of that pedigree, and it does seem to be a little bit different genetically in terms of one of the potential new virulence factors that we found. That would indicate also, again, there's a lot of variation around during that time, which means there must have been a lot of plague around in general. And maybe this particular one then had the right components to really put sort of the final nail in the coffin there.
Just one moment, David, shortly. Remember what David Weiss said about this bottleneck in the steppe that seemed to have happened around 3,500 approximately. It's a shame that your paper wasn't before David's, because this would have been another line of argument or explanation for this steppe bottleneck. And in fact, that would also explain that they have experienced it much earlier, but again gained immunity. And then when the spread went further to the west and the steppe people came afterwards, they had the immunity already received. Yeah. And that would explain also, in the same context what you described, the weakening of a previous society being superseded with one that had experience with this disease but much earlier.
Yeah. Martin?
Okay, so two short comments. One is that there are not mass graves, but for instance, there are graves with multiple individuals. The one that are dated to the Yamnaya period in the steppes that have not been analyzed. Martin and I were talking about this last night. That have not been analyzed for disease. So there's one that I can think on the top of my head that has a male adult, a female adult, and 3 subadults in the same grave sitting in the same floor. And as it turns out, none of them are related to each other within 3 degrees. It's not a family at all. Why are they 5 people on the floor of the same grave dated to the Yamnaya period? Exactly. It hasn't been tested yet. Oh, the other comment is that looking at this from the point of view of this expansion of the steppe people, in the warrior bands, the comparative mythology associated with adolescent war bands, the 2 gods that are most closely associated with adolescent war bands are Apollo, who's always represented as an adolescent himself, and in the Indic system, Rudra, who's associated. He's the father of the Maruts, who are boys who go to war and cause tremendous violence. Both Rudra and Apollo have associated with them spears that cast disease in front of them, and they're also associated with healing disease. So there's definitely a linkage in comparative Indo-European mythology between the adolescent war bands and some idea of a god who's casting disease in front of them. And that would correlate exactly with what they were encountering as they spread through Europe. They think it's their own gods who are doing this.
So the winning gods, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, not just a small addition also to this idea about maybe if the bottleneck in the Yamnaya. One of the, I think Christian showed the graph of our other study where we basically just look at where we can find plague and other diseases and when. So there is at least one of our earliest samples is, it's not Yamnaya, but it's in one of the Bota individuals actually that we didn't catch at that time, right? So it is in the step in this early time period. We can't really say which lineage it actually is because we don't have enough data, but we can at least pinpoint that it was some form of plague was there at that time period.
Thanks, Christian, for the inspiring paper. I would just like to mention we should not completely rule out the 3,400 climate impact. And it does not contradict, because when you have already climatic problems and diseases on animals and bad income from crops, if then a plague comes, the catastrophe is even worse.
Yeah, you're weakened.
Yeah, and then, for example, in the dolmen of Oberpip, they found Salmonella enterica. That's another disease, not totally deadly, but it weakens again. So, and this is proven by deep calcareous material. So that's one thing. And to give another example from these, what I yesterday just mentioned, these collapse of the resources provision from the Paris Basin. That's a distance of 800 kilometers, but in the early half of the fourth millennium, up to 60–70% of the flint material comes from this area. And then it drops drastically. So after 3,200, they only provide local resources, which is really a bad flint, bad silex. So that could be linked to this. I think this, especially the distribution of flintstones, when you use microfossil analysis, you can get really precise networks, and that we should also work more on this.
Do we have time? I don't know. Any more questions? Then I think I'll give the floor back to you. Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you.
Look, guys, we were supposed to have a final discussion here, but I think looking in your faces and in ours as well,
No.
I think these were four. I think we had four really incredible, highly informative, but also very exhaustive days. So I think we better skip the final discussion here, because also over the last couple of days we had many discussions after each individual paper, at the end of each session, and so what else shall we discuss now? This is also the next question. I mean, we had been hearing so many new stories here, so many new results of scientific research, archaeological research, but also to some extent linguistic research. And it opens, at least for me, it opens up new horizons of data that needs to be processed, of methods, and also of explanations of the events that transformed Europe in the third millennium BC. I'm grateful that Martin Vorholt gave us at the beginning of this morning a recap of what happened in Riva, because this was the intention from us from the very beginnings. These are not two conferences. This is one conference with two parts, and the first part, due to special circumstances, had to be done in Riva in last October. And Franco, you did the absolute great job, not only organizing the Riva 2 conference, but 25 years before, a quarter of a century before, the first Belpica conference in Riva. So in this respect, we also had a link with the past of the 20th century, and now having a follow-up conference on Belpicas 25 centuries later in the 21st century with new methods, new results, new perspectives that were incredible to reminiscent what had happened in the 20th century. We wouldn't have that possibilities that we have now. And again, the second part now here in Budapest, these are two parts of a single story of the transformation of Europe in the third millennium BC. And in the meanwhile, thanks Gabi for putting this up. We would like to invite you, particularly the speakers of the last 4 days, but also those who have submitted posters to publish with us proceedings of this conference. Because, again, we think that both parts will become a milestone also in terms of understanding third millennium BC archaeology, a milestone also in terms of documentations and ideas to be published with us. And again, we then look forward for another 25 years, maybe, when another initiative will come up and supersedes then what we as a group of scholars produce here in the third decade of the 21st century. And with that, Gabi, if you move on, this is what we have in mind in terms of the publication. So with the ERC Impact Project, and out of the dilemma that we had with COVID, we started to produce books. We are glad to say that in the meanwhile, we have 4 monographs being created. These are their covers and their backsides. We have 2 more to be produced right now in this year. They will come out in this year, one being made by Piotr, the other by Bianca over there. And in the same series, we would like to have also published the proceedings. And also it's a series here in connection with Archeolingua. Of course, again, another Budapest link for which we are very grateful. And so we assume that that the 2 volumes that we want to produce are for the transformation of Europe, one dedicated to Riva, the other dedicated to Budapest here, will be in a... Can you go back again? Shall be in the same format as we did.
Please don't escape. No?
Should be in the same format as we produced here the Yamana Interactions proceedings of a conference we had in Helsinki some 5 years ago. We have already sent out the call for contributions for the Riva conference, and with that I hand briefly over to Franco here.
And now the next one.
It was the end of July.
It was for
July?
decision.
Is it
June, the second.
There's a mistake. This is the first and this is the second deadline for Riva. The first was the end of June. So feel free to send at the end of June because, maybe we will give a second deadline, but, we want to publish very, very quickly because, this kind of evolution of research and disciplines is so quick that we cannot think on the next conference on the third millennium BC in 25 years, but maybe in 2 years, 3 years, maybe less, because the research is going on. And I think that the most important thing I've seen in Riva and here is this method of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. Roland Barthes said that interdisciplinarity is not to watch an object from different disciplines. Interdisciplinarity, the object being a new object, an unknown object for every discipline. So be aware, we have to be aware that we are talking about new methods, new challenges, and we have to be prepared about this because from my point of view, I have to think that what I do not understand is not a stupid thing. I have to go on and try to understand the different opinions. And that's why I think that we have to be very fast in publishing the results of the 2 conferences. And please, from my side, of course, send the papers because it will be a new milestone, I hope, together with the publication of the Budapest proceedings. Thank you.
Also, Gabi, final slide here, please.
Yes. And the Budapest deadline, please.
Yeah, Budapest deadline, again, as Franco said, we want to do it as fast as possible because, again, research is moving on, new science is moving on, and we are living nowadays in a very fast changing archaeological environment, also with transformation nowadays. So our intention is to have to ask you for the contributions by the end of November. And if you are then not, by that time, not having reacted, you will get another email from us. And so we try to pester you a little bit into, into submitting in this respect. Also, what is important, we don't want to produce huge volumes. So also the frame of the Yamnaya interaction was about 550 pages, and having so many contributions for each conference means that we will set up limits in terms of words for submission. So for full presentations, 5,000 words. For poster presentations, 3,000 words, but with a adjacent, a big number of adjacent figures to be included. So, and we will send out emails to you in the next couple of days and weeks, and we will forward you the details, and we will ask you to contribute. So this is our last wish for these two transformation conferences that we had in Riva and here. And before saying finally goodbye, I have another issue to
and me too.
To mention.
Give me.
Hang on. It's my.
Oh.
It's actually
two. Hungarian wine.
Yep.
Yeah. Really.
Gabi.
Gabi.
This all would not have been possible without you. I mean, we had been acting as a team together in Riva and now here, but without your wonderful organization here in Budapest, I don't think any one of us would have had the same experience as we had in the last 4 days. I cannot be grateful enough. And I know that you like occasionally a nice dry Hungarian wine. I know you like Furmint from Tokaj, but only the dry ones. So I went out this morning into a supermarket, but then they haven't had real big bottles, so I bought 2 small ones instead. Gabi, that's for you, and that's also
Thank you very much.
for you.
And I would like to say thank you very much first for the speakers, for the very exciting papers, and for the poster guys, for the posters, and for the audience here and on the stream, and for my colleagues who are at the background and help us in several issues in these nice days. So, and finally I have a special gift and special thanks for my co-organizers. So I have a special gift, a cube, invented by Ernő Rubik, a very creative Hungarian man. So in my mind, very good connection to the transformation process. So please figure out the transformation in the 3rd, 4th, 5th millennium BC. So it is a very, very, very good thing. So thank you very much for all of you, and to Volker and to Franco as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabi. And I think with that, that's the end of our 4 days now. Wish you all the best. Have safe travels home from wherever you came from. And as I said, we will stay in touch by emailing in the next couple of days and weeks. And maybe there's another chance in the near future to meet again and to have another nice meeting with colleagues and friends. Thank you.